So, in this final session, we've set ourselves a very modest challenge, having explored some of these issues over the last day and a half, to think about who we should engage in the challenge, the effort to solve the challenge, or the multiple challenges that we've been exploring. What a roadmap for addressing those challenges might look like. Who we'd need to engage in that challenge, and we've talked about all sorts of actors already that have come up from different disciplinary specialisms, governments, industry, publics in different countries and settings. So, I mean, recognising that we're not going to solve the problems of the world in an afternoon, much as we'd like to, I think something which I'd really like to focus on, particularly as we get towards the end of the day, is what next steps might be, and what we can do as a sort of group of people gathered here together, what we might want to take forward out of this into, for example, the Resourcing Future Generations meeting in Vancouver next year, in terms of actions we can take now, other fora that we could be spinning out into. So those are some thoughts to have in our minds as we hear the final 5 speakers of our conference, and we've got a fantastic lineup again this afternoon. So to kick off this afternoon, it's a great pleasure to welcome Karen Hanghøj, who is CEO of EIT Raw Materials. Thank you, Karen. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And actually, I don't think any of you know this, but I have another hat than the EIT War Materials hat. I'm actually the chair or the president of the Danish Geological Society. And so it's sort of a being here in you could say, the mother of all the geological societies. It's a little fancier than the desk in the closet that we have in Copenhagen, but it's really a pleasure to be here at the Burlington House. I think that's great for me. And I'm going to thank you again for inviting me, and also I apologize I wasn't here yesterday. It was a really great program by the looks of it, and the lectures earlier, the talks earlier today, I think have all been really, really interesting and excellent. And I'm going to sort of continue a little bit with some of those things, and I have sort of 2 parts to what I'm going to say. It's going to be something again about the sustainability of things and how to make a better world, but maybe a little bit more arm waving than the people who spoke earlier today. And of course, it's easy to do the arm waving. I love to do it, but it's very easy to do because we all know what it comes down to: actually implementing the things that we need to do to be sustainable and to do things in a better way. That gets complicated. So I'm not going to say a lot about how we implement it, but I will arm wave a little bit, and then I will talk about EIT Raw Materials, because this is my first chance, I think, to do so in the UK. And so I wanted to also introduce who we are and what we do and what hopefully we can bring to the sector in Europe. And I have a thing here to go forward with. All right. So I am really going to start with the arm waving and the Sustainable Development Goals, because if you think about what we are trying to do in Europe on a European level, but even of course also on a global level, we are really trying to do things in a better way, and we've become very aware that the raw materials plays into how we do this. And the raw materials we've heard earlier today play into, of course, into a lot of these different goals here. But so how is it that we have to think about raw materials in a sort of greater picture of things? And I will start with some predictions that came from the World Economic Forum a couple of years ago actually, sort of looking to the future and saying, what is the minerals and metals situation going to look like in 2050? And they say we'll see 5 sort of major tendencies. We'll see a strong move towards recycling and circularity. We'll see that mining will not disappear. The need for raw materials will not disappear. The technologies will matter more than ever, and understanding the value chains will be very important. And I think, in some sense, we were discussing briefly with Andrew before, I think we are sort of probably preaching to the choir here in this room, but I think that the acknowledgement of sort of the broader public that this is true is sort of our chance to actually have an impact on how things are done in the future. So I'll talk a little bit about these things and about the value chain and how we perceive it. And so from a European perspective a little bit, at least initially, and so what's the situation for Europe? So this is sort of a figure that might have been showed yesterday. I don't know. It's from the raw materials scoreboard that I'll return to in a sec. But it basically shows the mining regions of the world, and on the y-axis it shows the proportion of the global production of those mine regions. And when you look at it, you can see, of course, that if you go back 150 years, Europe was by far the dominant region, supplying the world with raw materials, supplying ourselves to a large extent, building all of our industries in Europe, our successful industries today on exploiting our resources back in the last century. When we get up around 1900, the United States takes over, and through the world wars, pretty much the United States, that's the leading in the red. And then we see around 1970, we see that it is becoming much more diversified, which might actually be a good thing, I don't know. But we have now mining in lots of different regions, and you can see them up on the top there. There's China, there's the former Soviet countries, there's Australia and Canada in the light blue, and then we have these 6 resource-rich countries in yellow lumped together: Chile, Brazil, Peru, South Africa, and so forth. And so the way it's looking today is that Europe is actually producing the least of all of these. We're down to maybe 3 to 5% of the global mineral production, and the only region that's actually increasing its proportion of the global mining is China. And so that's sort of what the global picture looks like. And one can argue that this might not necessarily be a problem, that this diversification is probably a good thing. But it's certainly a reality that we in Europe, we use about 25 to 30% of the world resources, and we're only producing this 3 to 5%. So this creates an import dependency and all kinds of issues that, of course, give criticality, give scarcity, and everything else. So it's sort of time to look at this and sort of say, well, how can we think about raw materials maybe moving forward, and how should we think about it from a European perspective? So the whole criticality issue, of course, and I think you spoke about that yesterday, there was something about critical raw materials, but it precipitated a reaction worldwide that was sort of putting geologists on the map, literally, in the political system, because it made a lot of people realize that our industries might not actually have access to what we think they should have access to. And this also happened in Europe, and so in sort of the 2008-9, about then, the Raw Materials Initiative was launched on European level, and this is sort of the EU Raw Materials Policy Strategy. And basically it comes in 3 parts, or there are 3 sort of fundamental parts to this European strategy. It is the strategy itself, so the Raw Materials Initiative, then it's the EIP, which stands for the European Innovation Partnership on Raw Materials, which is a partnership that brings together pretty much all stakeholders across Europe into a high-level advisory group, you could say, to the Commission. Then, of course, there's the Horizon 2020, so the framework program. And in the Horizon 2020, 600 million euros were secured for raw materials research and other types of projects from 2014 to 2020. And under Horizon 2020, we have the EIT War Materials, which is where I come from, which is an additional 400 million on top of the other Horizon money in the period of 15 to 2021. And so I'll just talk, it's really boring probably, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about it because it sort of frames who we are and what we're doing. So the EIT, so the Raw Materials Initiative, so that you say the strategy, basically looks at sort of 3 pillars. The first one being fair and sustainable supply of raw materials from global markets, making it very relevant what we've heard earlier today, that we probably realize that, you know, it's the geology that decides where we have the raw materials. And so even though there's a discrepancy between what we consume and what we produce, we're never going to produce exactly what we need in every single society. We're going to produce things across the world, and we want to make sure that we do that in good ways and also to secure our own supply. Several subcategories for that. I'm not going to go through those. Also fostering sustainable supply within the EU. And I think this is something that is very important, because we've seen a trend of decreasing mining, and now we're sort of looking at an articulated strategy that we need more production in Europe, both from secondary and primary sources, but also from primary sources. And that goes into the third one, boosting resource efficiency and promoting recycling, and better basically implement the waste directives and other legislation that is done on EU level. So these are sort of the 3 main things that this strategy wants to do. And there's a lot of cross-cutting you say issues or tools that are being implemented. So there's a criticality analysis, analysis of markets and stockpiling. There's a European rare earth competency network. This was very much, I think, the rare earth crisis that precipitated this reaction from the European Union, so thank you for that. Also enhancing the EU knowledge base. This is something that has been getting quite a lot of attention in the last few years, is how do we harmonize our data, how do we make it available to everyone, and finally promoting research and promoting skills. And so the European Innovation Partnership, which is then sort of an implementation of this strategy, a group that meets occasionally and talks about how we can do it, they basically wrote a strategic implementation plan. So how are we going to implement this? What is it we're actually going to do? And there are sort of two main objectives. I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but there's sort of two big objectives: to promote or to reduce dependency on imports and promote the production and exports, and also to put Europe at the forefront of in the raw materials sector. So those are the two sort of overarching goals, and then there's all kinds of sub things going on under here. Here again, you can see the kick of raw materials. I'll return to that. But basically what this boiled down to in the sort of how we're going to do this is 95 concrete actions that are sort of reflected in the Horizon 2020, and 7 priority areas that Europe should concentrate on. And these are the 7 areas: research and innovation coordination, technologies for primary and secondary raw materials production, substitution of raw materials, improving the raw materials framework conditions, improving Europe's waste management framework conditions and excellence, knowledge, skills, and raw material flow, so also looking at the sort of mineral intelligence in a greater extent, and finally international cooperation. And that's, of course, again back to what we have heard about earlier today, that inherently the raw materials sector is global. So even if we try to put on the European glasses, if we do something really, really good, it's not really going to make a better world unless we can actually disseminate it into the greater world. And this here you are definitely not supposed to read, but this is just a table of the projects that have been running under Horizon 2020 so far in the fields of raw material. And this is actually a pretty impressive list. You can sort of see that there are these are sort of outreach and coordination actions. Then we have mining, we have processing, we have recycling, and we have substitution. So now we're in sort of more thematics here. And in each of these, we have a number of projects that have been executed and are previously, right now, being executed across Europe with many different stakeholders. Many of actually who are also in this room are participating in many of these projects. And so I think this is certainly something that when we go back and look at some of the earlier framework programs, look at Framework Program 7, there was a handful. If you look at Framework Program 6, I think there was maybe one project that you could sort of really interpret as being about raw materials. So raw materials are on the European agenda. And I think that we have a big, we probably have a challenge, but we have a big, important task in trying to keep it on the agenda. The EIP, so the European Innovation Partnership on Raw Materials, also have made a raw materials scoreboard. And again, you probably can't read it and you shouldn't, but if you haven't seen the scoreboard, it's worthwhile checking it out. And what they do is basically they set up a number of different things that we can measure impact on in the raw materials value chain. So we have a share of imports and mining, so this is mainly related to that. Here we have some recycling, here we have some of the environmental things that we can look at. Here's mineral exploration, domestic production, there's all these things that play into it. And the idea, of course, is that we will look at all of these and then we'll say all this work that we've done in Europe to, in the raw materials field, we can actually measure that it has an impact. And the depressing part, of course, is that this has been on the agenda now. The raw materials, in a big way, have been on the agenda in the last 10 years in Europe, and so far we probably do not see hardly any impact. We see an academic impact on some level. We have some more students, we have some great publications and papers, but the actual impact in terms of how much we are importing, those kinds of things, that still remains to be seen. And that is partly, of course, because of the timescale that we also heard about earlier today. The timescales on which mining occurs and opens, new mines open, and then also the lifetime of the mine, all those kinds of things. We're talking decadal timescales here, and I think that this is a very important, we all know this, you all know this, but the problem is the people who are going to decide what the next framework program is going to look like in Europe might not know this. So we really have a challenge in explaining this to Europe, that we want to do this. That brings me then to EIT, so now I'll talk a little bit about our KIC, so the EIT on raw materials. So EIT is, of course, the European Institute of Innovation and Technology, and it is an agency under the European Commission, and it is in this framework program actually under Horizon 2020, you could say. And the idea is that this is a different instrument than the sort of traditional calls in Horizon 2020, and that the EIT should bring together the three sides of what we call the knowledge triangle. So they should bring together academia, so education, and research with industry. So those are the three sides of the knowledge triangle, and sort of in an ideal world, you can imagine that all kinds of great innovation will happen there. And so it's not so much about fundamental research, but it's more about taking that research and bringing it to towards the market and having an innovation component. So the way that this is done is that the EIT supports so-called KICs, and KIC stands for Knowledge and Innovation Communities. And so it's partnership organizations where the partners are sharing projects and sharing ideas and hopefully making some great things happen. Oops, that went the wrong way. Okay. So there are 6 KICs at the moment in different sectors. So the model of the KIC is something that in principle should be applicable to many different sectors. And the raw materials KIC, of course, is the one that we're interested in, and it's called EIT Raw Materials. And the vision is to develop raw materials into a major strength for Europe. And if you look at the vision of the European Innovation Partnership or the European Technology Platform for Sustainable Mineral Resources, or any of the other networks that we have in Europe, or even globally, these goals are all pretty much exactly the same. It's about basically turning raw materials into something that we do really well. The mission is to boost competitiveness, growth, and attractiveness of the European raw materials sector through innovation and through entrepreneurship, and through that to secure raw material supply. So again, that's very high on the agenda. Design solution and close material loops. So that's all very arm-waving, and that we'll try to do. So the KIC, EIT Raw Materials, consists of about 120 partners currently from these three sides of the knowledge triangle, and from 23 different countries across Europe. And as you can actually see, I know we have Swiss people in the audience. We actually have Switzerland on board, even though it's not EU. We will have Norway on board on Tuesday next week when we have our next General Assembly, and we'll vote in our first Norwegian member. And of course, we also have the UK. We do not have many UK members, and I know I shouldn't probably talk much about it in this room. It's awkward, but we really would love to have some more members from the UK, Brexit or not, into this collaboration. And I think that actually the beauty of the collaboration is actually that it is so widely distributed in Europe, and we have also a very large group of partners from Eastern Europe, and are trying to expand that. So the way we are currently organized is that we have 6 regional offices in different parts of Europe where it, from a raw materials perspective, sort of makes sense. And then we have a headquarter that is based in Berlin. So we have a co-location center in northern Sweden, or CLC we call them, but these regional hubs, you can say. So this is where we have a little group of staff. So this is, of course, in the region of the mining of Boliden and LKAB. We have a co-location center in Finland. We have one in Poland. We have one in Leuven in Belgium, and we have one in Metz in France, and then we have a co-location center also in Rome. There's a couple of other things on there because we are opening up these little hubs that we're trying to outreach, especially into Eastern Europe, by opening tiny offices without much staff, but where a lot of activities will play out from. So that's what the partnership looks like, and that's, of course, the backbone of the KIC. And I should say, and some of you already know this, of course, it's a partnership, and that sounds, of course, really, really wonderful, but it's also a partnership that actually pays membership fees to be members. So we get some money from the European Union, and then we get some money from our partners, and then we try to put them to activities that I will tell you about in a sec. So what is it we do with EIT Raw Materials? We think about raw materials in a very broad way. So there's some partners that are very interested in exploration, some that are very interested in mining, and some that are very interested in the much more downstream things like recycling and circular economy. So we actually really think about raw materials as the entire value chain. And I think that's maybe, if there's one sort of key message to my arm waving, I think that that is exactly that. I think we really need to promote a view of raw materials in a very holistic way and a very value chain oriented way. And that actually also, I think, goes for a lot of the things we heard about earlier today with how we reach out to third world countries and artisanal mining, that we have to make the whole thing come together. So our value chain, we think about is we have 6 themes: exploration and raw materials, mineral assessments, resource assessments, mining in challenging environments. So this is maybe also pushing the envelope for mining, looking at, we'd like to look at also marine mining, but we're not yet, but mining deeper, mining lower grades, mining in the Arctic, things we can think about. Increased resource efficiency in mineral and metallurgical processes, recycling, material chain optimization for end-of-life products, substitution of critical materials and toxic materials, but also materials for optimized performance. And I'll show you some examples of our projects. I'll actually show you some lists of our projects, and then you can go and investigate more if you're interested. But as you see, our substitution projects actually fall in 2 different categories. One is sort of a lightweighting category, and one is more the critical raw materials. And then finally, design and products and services for the circular economy, sort of the overarching one. And a better way for me to think about this, and I apologize because some of you I know have seen this figure before, the way I like to think about the value chain is actually a circular value chain instead of a linear value chain, and I think we really have to promote this view of the value chain. And this is the official EU figure downloaded from the European Commission for what they think circular economy looks like. And there's several issues with this figure, which is really why I, again, sort of want to urge geologists and people who actually know anything about the nature of raw materials to insert themselves very heavily into the discussion about circular economy, because it's too important for us to leave this to the economists, because there are things that they do not understand. And so I think we want to look at this value chain or the circular economy from the perspective of the minerals and metals. And so we have to change a few things. We get rid of the wheat, water, and wood. Not that that's not important. Of course, it is important. Energy is also important. It's all part of the circular economy. But now we just want to put on the minerals glasses here. And so we'll put a mine, because regardless of how great we're going to get at recycling, and I know you probably discussed this yesterday, we will always need to put things into the loop somehow, and that is done through a mine. We, of course, know in this room very well that before we can get into the mine, we actually have to find the deposit, identify it. This takes a really long time, but this is a very important part of the value chain, and a lot of resources go into that, or should go into that. And before we can even get to this point where we are down there on the ground with the hand lens, we have to understand where we have to go and look. So there's a whole knowledge value chain that comes before any of the stuff that actually makes it into this loop, this material loop. Another big problem with this loop here is that it looks very attractive. You take your raw material and then you design something really cool with this rock, but we also, of course, know that this is not how it goes. We need to process it. So this is missing from the Commission figures. So we put some processing on here. And very importantly, actually, this is at the joint of the primary and the secondary resources, because it's actually, this is the crucial step in which is more economic, which is more environmentally okay, both from a perspective of chemical, mechanical treatments, but perhaps also in terms of energy. If it takes more energy to get gold out of this than out of a rock, which one should we choose? And it sort of is one of those places where innovation can actually potentially make a really, really big difference for us doing things in a much better way. And of course, finally, the main problem perhaps of all of them with this figure is that we have now this nice figure here with, it looks really nice. It's nice and fat all the way around. And you have some consumerism down here, and then you have a little bit of residual waste going off to the side. And in this, again, figure, it is the stuff that didn't get collected. It's the cell phone that we didn't put in the right bin, but we're leaving it in our drawer. But of course, it's much more complicated than that. We have waste along the entire value chain. And there's lots and lots of leakage. And no one talks too much about that. And I think that we need to start talking about the waste everywhere we have it. How can we minimize the waste? And how can we keep, I guess for me, that's the definition of the raw materials circular economy. A value chain is not to make a perfectly closed loop, because it's never going to happen. There's always going to be leakage. But it is to keep material in the loop for as long as possible. That's how we can sort of think about making it sustainable. And I think that when we look at this, or when others look at this, they oftentimes sort of have this notion that the mining, this part here, this is really bad, and it's really environmentally nasty, and it's dirty, and of course the recycling is really, really green. And we know, and I think probably, I'm going to guess that Andrew said something about this yesterday when you did your talk on waste, that is not always the case. And it's also not the case that when we look at how we recycle things, then we say, oh yeah, we're doing really well, we're recycling 50% of this. But what we're actually doing is that for many metals, especially, we are not just recycling, we're actually downcycling. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but it means that realistically, we have to keep putting stuff into the material loops to maintain it. And so there's lots of innovation potential. So this is another way of showing our 6 themes. So we have our mineral resource assessment and our exploration here. We have our mining here. We have our efficient processing here, design for the circular economy, and then of course the recycling. And so I think my take-home sort of message on this one is really that we can't save the world and reach all of our sustainable development goals by looking at one of these things and say, oh, we just need to do mining better and then everything is going to be fine, or we just need to do recycling better and then everything is going to be good. And we certainly can't just say we're going to have a circular economy and then everything is going to disappear. So I think that we have to be very realistic about the leakages and what is possible and where we need to do research and innovation in this value chain. And we need to communicate it not necessarily to each other, but to people who don't understand this. So what is it actually that we do? When I say we work with this wonderful circular value chain and we have activities, what is it we do? So we have in EIT War Materials, we have basically sort of 4 families, main families of activities. We have matchmaking and networking. We have business creation and support. We have validation and acceleration, and we have learning and education. And I'll go through all 4 of them just briefly to give you some examples. Then we have some sort of transversal ones that we call regional innovation scheme. This is a European construct of how can we increase the innovation potential in the regions of Europe that are not perhaps as innovative or as wealthy as the rest of Europe. So this is mainly Eastern Europe, to some extent parts of Southern Europe. And then also internationalization, because again, we can do a lot of things in Europe, but we have to have the global glasses on when we talk about raw materials. So we have to basically activate our international networks and make sure that if we are actually able to make beautiful innovations and new technologies come through and best practices, that is actually going to be something that will have a global impact, because otherwise it is really not going to matter that much. It's going to matter maybe in the local area where you have some kind of facility, but it's not going to matter on a global scale. So matchmaking and networking, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's kind of what we're doing here. It's we have an online portion of our matchmaking and networking events, which is sort of an intranet for our partners that we're building up right now. But other than that, it is matches, it's meetings, it's events where we bring people together to talk about raw materials, but also bring students to companies, entrepreneurs to companies, entrepreneurs to investors, idea camps. This can be sort of an open innovation concept where you maybe have a company in our partnership that has a problem or has an idea and just basically chooses to invite people over to discuss potential solutions. We have something called entrepreneurship facilitator with an I, it's not a spelling error. So the idea here is, of course, again, that within companies we can help develop an entrepreneurial culture and have events that can help the company move forward on certain things. The business creation and support is a very important part of actually what we're supposed to be doing. And like I said before, we are a partnership consisting of universities, research institutions, and industry partners. But because there's this fairly large membership fee, we don't have a lot of small companies, but we actually have an obligation to try to sort of mobilize the grassroots and get some startups, get some SMEs into the sector. So we have an obligation to disseminate beyond the partnership. And one of the ways we do that is with our business creation and support activities, where we, one, can have direct support of startups and of SMEs by helping them develop business models. We can coach, we can incubate, we can do various things, and we can support new spin-offs with in them creating new businesses. But we also have directly growth boosters, so we have the ability to just give them money, not enormous amounts of money, but our startups we typically give up to 60,000 euros that they can then get to try to forward their idea, or maybe to secure greater investments. And we can provide what we call soft landing for the SME expansion, and we can do tailor-made benchmarking and matchmaking of local and regional actors. And this is actually something we've seen already quite a lot. I should say that we started, our first operational year was 2016, so 17 was coming to an end now, is our second operational year. We funded for 7 years with a possible extension of another 7 years with probably some less funding. But already in these first 2 years, we have supported, I think, something like 60 startups or so. And an interesting thing is that several of those have actually entered into partnerships with our senior partners. So they're now writing agreements with LKAB or with Sandvik or other companies that we have. So this is turning out to be a really interesting tool also for our big partners. Then we have validation and acceleration, and this is by far our largest family of activities. And this is where, if you've been sort of sitting there looking for the word research or research and development, this is where you should be looking, because this is sort of the projects that we do that have a research, innovation, development component, but it is ideally something that is building on already existing research and already existing even sort of exploration of, is this something that could potentially change the way we do things in the industry? So this is about upscaling. This is about bringing technologies and also services closer to the market. And idea is, of course, to integrate existing technologies into new ways, to de-silo and to do sort of value chain cooperation. I had these 6 themes before. It's a convenient way for us to think about what it is we're doing, and I'm going to show you some examples on projects that belong to each of these themes. But the reality is, of course, that most of the projects bridge these themes and should bridge these themes to a large extent. And then C, very importantly, bring technologies to the market. That's sort of the main idea. So that's our biggest family of projects, upscaling projects. We also, in our validation and acceleration or innovation projects, as we call them, we also have something that we call networks of infrastructure, which is also, I think, pretty self-explanatory. The idea here is that different partners pool expertise or facilities. It can be analytical facilities, it can be data or other things, but basically pool them and make them available somehow to the partnership, but also, again, beyond the partnership, make them available to SMEs, make them available to the sector. Learning and outreach, another important family of activities. And actually, I'd also say this is one of the things that sets the KICS somewhat apart from the Horizon 2020 programs and many of the national programs, is that there's really a strong focus on education and entrepreneurial education within the sector of each of the KICS. And actually, the money for EIT, something that many people don't know, actually comes out of the DG Education and Culture in Brussels, and not out of research and innovation. It actually comes from the education side, and so we have a big obligation to do that. And I think for the raw materials sector, this is really critical, I think, because The other KICs, we have, for instance, a KIC that's the same generation KIC as us, so also in the second operational year, that's called EIT Health, and they work with healthy aging. And this is something that everyone can identify with. And they also, they also cure cancer, and they do all kinds of cool things. And it's not hard for them to sell to the general public that what they do is really important. It's also not hard for them to sell to students or to children that what we do is really important and it's really cool. And if you're smart, you're going to want to do it too. And this is an inherent problem for us, not so much for the geologists in the raw materials sector. We all know that geologists have more fun than almost anyone else. But the mining engineers and all of the downstream people, they have a recruiting problem. And so we try to really focus on this a lot. And so we have several layers in the educational activities too. We have the PhD and master education. We all know what that means. We make modules, we make full programs where different universities work together. We have professional education for people already in the sector that is relevant and interesting, and we have industry partners that are supporting that, so that's also good. But then very importantly, the wider society learning, and there's so many elements in that, and originally this was thought to be a minor activities, but it's actually turning out from my perspective to be one of the most important things that we do, because this is both explaining to people not like us out in the real world why raw materials are important and how they're everywhere. I know you talked about this yesterday, so I'm not going to reiterate all of the good arguments. But it is also securing recruitment for the future, because as it is right now, we have these higher education programs that we do with the masters and PhDs, and we have more than 50 education programs. But what I fear sometimes that we're doing is that we're creating 3 or 4 really, really attractive PhD courses or master's courses, and then they're stealing this, they're competing for the same little cohort of students who've already decided this is what they're going to do. So we have to steal students from health and from social sciences or whatever. We have to basically really make this sector attractive. And I think that it is attractive. So I think it shouldn't be so hard for us to sell that point, but I think we really have a challenge in doing that. And so the wider society learning is also actually working with school children, so that we can, 10 or 15 years down the road, hopefully we can recruit young, smart people who actually know that raw materials are very cool and very important, and it's also about robotics and being nerdy and geeky and things like that. So that's a very important activity line. All of these activities that are partner run, so these are the learning and education projects and these upscaling projects and networks of infrastructure, they're run by the partners, they're consortia that apply, and we evaluate it, and then some of them are granted and they can run their project. And these projects we call CARVAs, and this is EU, and so it's all about the alphabet soup. So the CARVA here stands for KIC Added Value Activity. So these are basically the projects that we fund and the activities that we do from the money that we get in from the European Commission. But the idea of the KICs is also that this is carried by, or it's building on our partners already having significant expertise in the area. And we call that KIC complementary activity. So our partners basically come in and they show that we're already doing this Horizon project and this SOS project and this national project, and we can build on that and we can make a great added value project. And that, so basically we put on, and then we call the whole thing for KIC activities, and so can sort of share it freely in our network. And so the upscaling projects that we do and the entrepreneurship support that we do, you can sort of summarize in this slide here, where if you have a really good idea and it's really researchy, then you have a good chance of getting public funding if you're good and if your idea is good. But you have a very marketable idea, you've already made the gadget, it's very, very clear people are going to want to buy it. You can go to the banks, you can go to the venture capitalists, they'll give you money to do it. If you're in the middle here, you have a mature idea, but the research councils are going to look at you and say, that's not research, that's too applied. You've got to go get your money somewhere else. And the bank is going to say, this is way too risky. We're not going to do that. And we call this, or some people call this, the valley of death. We actually like to call it the valley of hope because we're optimists. But the idea is with our projects, both with our partners, to help them across this gap, with giving them some booster funding, some acceleration funding, but also for these young entrepreneurs to basically give them a little bit of funding so they can cross that valley. Our portfolio, I've gone to yellow now, that worries me a little bit. Our portfolio for 2018, I'll just go through this very quickly for sort of examples of what we actually do, and then if you're interested, come talk to me or go to our website. This is what we hope to be doing next year for about 70 million. Some of that is co-funding, but we're getting probably something like 60 from the EIT. And you can see here how they divide across the different themes. Very well balanced in the circle. We have 16% exploration, mining, processing, recycling and substitution, and some that cover all and a few that covers the circular economy. And if you look at the different areas, you can see here again the validation acceleration, by far the greatest activity line that we have. It's expensive to upscale, basically. I also just want to show this regional innovation scheme. We're hoping to spend 3 million in Eastern Europe. And again, here we do try to cover the entire value chain, and we are working hard on trying to make sure that it's actually the countries in the region that will receive that money. Lists of projects, I'm not going to read all of them, but just to show you how many projects we actually have. So for 2018, we're going to have more than 200 partner-run projects. And in exploration, for instance, we have 26 projects, and 10 of these are upscaling. And I put those on these lists. I'm assuming that these slides will be shared afterwards, so you can kind of see the scope of the types of projects that we do within each of these 6 main themes. And it covers pretty much, of course, also how we do the education projects. So it covers typically many of the same themes. So you see here we have some drones, we have something about mapping, mineral resource assessment platform, we have seismic imaging technologies, we have quite a lot of technologies related to drill core measurements. If you look at the mining projects, we have 23 projects altogether. 13 of these are upscaling. It goes anywhere from new smart bolts to big nasty machines that can grind the rock in new ways, risk identification systems, predictive solutions for water balance management. We heard about that earlier also today. Those are the mining projects. Processing projects, we have 39 projects, 17 upscaling projects, and this is actually interesting because this is clearly something that our partners really want to do, and they want to do it on both primary ore, and they also want to do it on waste, consumer goods, but also quite a lot on mining waste. We actually have several projects on mining waste, which I think is going to potentially be a game changer in Europe and a great way for us to clean up and clean house and actually get some value out of it at the same time. Recycling, I went red, I'm almost done. Recycling, we have 37 projects, 9 of which are upscaling projects. And again, you can see battery recycling, recycling, phosphorus recovery from sewage. This is sort of not your traditional mining project, but still interesting stuff. Substitution, we have 31 projects and 14 upscaling projects. And again, here we have these 2 families. We have the light weighting. Can we substitute this metal for something that's lighter, either lighter metal or composite, and can we then get some great benefits? And we also have the critical raw materials substitution projects. Circular economy. So this is the last slide almost. So there we have 29 projects, but we only have 2 upscaling projects. And that's, of course, maybe a natural thing because it's something that there's a lot of interest in teaching this. So we have a lot of education projects on circular economy. Everyone wants to own the circular economy. It's the new black, and we have to own it. We have to remember that we have to own this. But this is being taught pretty much at all our partner universities now. But in terms of upscaling, of course, it's hard to upscale something that's only about circular economy because it's almost always going to be also about recycling or substitution or something else, and then it's going to be in that box. So again, there's value chain integration here. But we do have 2 quite interesting projects. We have one that is about certification, and we heard a little bit about that earlier today as well, about best practices, about fair trade, about can we imagine a world where we're going to have the consumers actually want to have something that is certified, and then also the manufacturer. And then we have a project on the life cycle assessment of raw materials, because we hear a lot about cradle to cradle, and it's also something that's been talked a lot about. Well, when people do these analyses, they start with a chunk of metal. They never look at the mining phase or the exploration phase and the energy consumption and all of the other resources that go into that part of the value chain. So I think this project is about that. It's going to be extremely difficult to do, but I think it's very important to do it. So just again, I'm almost done. to sort of go back to the circle here, we have to remember to do things along the entire value chain, all of us. And I think that we are at a crossroads, and we've heard a little bit about that earlier today, I think as well, where to a large extent it's going to be the manufacturer who's going to start, hopefully, taking responsibility for the sourcing of the raw material, but also for the recyclability of the raw material. And that is really going to be something that could be a game changer. So something I think that we should push for on a policy level. And then maybe we can make a better world. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Karen. Any quick questions, bearing in mind that we will have a final discussion session after tea, coffee to come back to. In that case, thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure now to welcome our next speaker, who is Froydis Cameron-Johansson. And Froydis is Group Head of International and Government Relations at Anglo American. There you are. Welcome, Froydis.
Thank you very much. Thank you. From my title, you might think, well, what's she doing at the Geological Society? I am actually a geologist and engineer originally, and I was for about a decade in the oil and gas sector, so spent my time on rigs in various holiday destinations around the world, like Nigeria and Sakhalin Island. So those of you who know those places will understand. I came into mining about 10 years ago, and I actually came in to head up what we called, I would guess, the non-technical side for a lot of the mega projects. So any of you who know Anglo American, about 10 years ago, the sector was on a big shopping spree, and we thought it would be fabulous to pick up a lot of these projects at the top of the cycle. So I had the great fortune to work on some unbelievable projects in all senses of the word. A couple of them would include Pebble in Alaska, those of you who know that deposit, Michiquillay in Peru, and a number of others. I then went back to my sort of geology roots and was in the exploration team, where I met Professor Gordon. Again, when I was in the exploration team, I was looking after a lot of the non-technical things for the exploration team globally. And of course, being a geologist, I totally understood where they were coming from, which was like, yeah, Froy, we like your ideas, but we're not sure we really need to do some of this stuff. So a lot of what I had to demonstrate to them was, you know what, we really should maybe understand some of our environmental impact a little bit better, or we should maybe be talking to the communities in a slightly different way. But it was great. I mean, I was there for 5 years, and we really sort of changed how we approached a lot of what we would call the non-technical areas, so the health, safety, environment, and the communities. So now I've taken up this group role, and it's a really interesting time in Anglo American at the moment, because we really are, I think, in the mining sector, as you've probably heard from a number of speakers in the last couple of days, we're on this sort of innovation cusp. And our group technical director really firmly believes this. And we are looking now, and again, with anything to do with innovation, you really do need to start looking at where are your disruptors, who are your disruptors, and to start thinking about it. You know, I know that the mining sector is renowned for its dynamism, its forward-looking approach to things, its innovation, and its speed of change. But there is a real recognition across the industry that we do need to be thinking about a lot of these things. I mean, you know, when you talk about the circular economy, I mean, that is going to be a big disruptor for our sector. How are we looking at that? How are we participating? How are we going to make ourselves relevant for the next 5, 10, 15 years? And as everybody in this room knows, you look at the pace of innovation in the other sectors, and it is just fast. You know, if you think it's going to be this time frame, half it, because somebody is going to find a solution. So what I wanted to talk to you today in the graveyard shift on a Friday afternoon, it's nap time in a dark room, so I'll try and make this as interesting and as lively as possible, is around FutureSmart Mining TM. I have to include the TM because this is actually what Anglo American has the IP on this. So let's get the brains going. See if anybody's asleep or awake. Any chuckles? Come on, guys. All right, let's just do the warm-up. All right, who are we? Okay, I would never be as arrogant as to assume that everybody knows who Anglo American is. When I first came into the sector, I absolutely thought it was a tobacco company. It's a very easy mistake to make. But who are we? So just a quick run through. I mean, we are a global diversified miner, and we have operations globally. We're predominantly in South Africa, although we are in Brazil, Chile, Peru, Zimbabwe. That's been my week in my current position. And of course, we are across the commodities. So we've got diamonds through De Beers, copper, platinum, group metals, iron ore, manganese, coal, and nickel. And just a little plug for the company. This year we are celebrating our 100 years. So it's not geological time, but it's pretty substantial for a company, I would say. So as I was saying to you before, you know, there is stuff happening around us, and we don't want to be the type of company where stuff happens to us. We need to make sure that we are aware of these things, we are embracing these things, and we're actually taking the time and having the headspace to think about these things. You know, I'm not saying geologists are all about looking at rocks, but I can tell you that mining engineers are all about digging. Processing engineers are all about processing. And so it's actually now for the company to really just stop, get the headspace to think about some of these really significant societal challenges and what those implications are for us as a company. So again, you know, I have colleagues here in the room whose job it really is to take a step back, look at the big picture, and really think about what is going on and what that means for our business. And I cannot emphasize enough the importance of that for a company in order to actually think about where it's going to go and what it's going to do. And if you don't take the time out, you're going to be in big problem. So, innovation. Again, see if anybody's watching the slides. So as I said to you before, you know, mining companies are renowned for their speed and their innovation. And of course, some of the, you know, talking to innovators that I've met, you know, especially in the tech companies, they're all saying the key things around innovation are around you've got to fail, and you've got to fail fast. Mining companies do not like to fail. And failing fast doesn't matter, man. They just don't want to fail full stop. So innovation for us as a company, even though we're very much in the technology space and we've done some great innovations, it's not fast. But as I was saying to you before, the speed at which things are happening and which we have to address a lot of these big societal issues is actually meaning we have to do something a bit different. So another one, which I'm not saying it's from Anglo, but there have been some similar conversations. So what are we doing about this? So again, as I say, you know, our technical director is very much pushing this. I mean, we have a head of innovation at Anglo American, and we're really looking to sort of really kind of see how we're going to manage the innovation cycle for some of the key issues that we have to address from an Anglo American perspective, but also from a mining sector perspective. Gosh. So one of the things is we have to really understand the challenges. So again, what are the big challenges that we are facing? And I'm sure in the discussions from the last couple of days, you know, these things have been coming out, and the themes are very much there. You know, water, energy, you know, processing, mining. These are very much, you know, what we do. How can we do them better, quicker, with less waste, with less impact? Ideate. I'd never come across this word before. Everybody kept saying, you've got to ideate. Let's ideate this issue. I was like, okay, I don't know what that means, but sure. Apparently it means to generate ideas. I could have worked that out, but the person who was telling it to me, it was a completely different context. But one of the things we have taken at Anglo American is to hold these open forums. And it's not just, you know, a gathering. It's a very structured process where we invite people across sector, across industry, different, just from all over the place, to address a problem that we have to help us think through. You know, we had sorry to ask Callum, but we had a number of open forums last year, one on energy, one on processing. We had a geological one, geosciences one recently, and again, it's getting people from all over. So, for example, on the processing one, we had engineers from NASA there to help us understand about, you know, water usage. We had people there from Levi Strauss. The denim industry is incredibly water intensive, and it's actually talking to them and seeing how we can take ideas from all these other sectors and industries that have been tackling these problems from a completely different lens. Collaboration, again, that goes back to the open forum. Consolidation, so again, it's really sort of embedding some of these technology programs into our core business activities. And then delivering. Of course, you can think about all this stuff, but if you're not actually delivering anything, what's the point? So we actually have, you know, a number of approaches here, which is, you know, the rapid delivery cycles, so smart paths, and that's really looking how we can really push these innovation cycles and these testing timelines. Learning plans, and then smart box. Smart box, quite interesting. Again, this is an internal thing that we're using at Anglo American, where people who have innovation ideas can apply for a smart box. And it is literally trying to enable people within the organization to help solve these problems, because these are problems that they are very familiar with, very close to, and oftentimes these are the people who have the most knowledge, or in other cases they have no knowledge of it, which sometimes also help looking at things from a fresh eyes perspective. And again, there we have that fast word again. So these are just some of the areas that we're looking on. Now, I will be totally transparent with you. I am not a processing engineer. I am not familiar with the in-depth detail of these technologies, and nor am I, if I was, would I be able to talk about them because of the IP. But just to give you a flavor of some of the things that we're looking at from an innovation space with FutureSmart Mining. So, the concentrated mine, again, this is about really, what does mining do? It digs up rocks and it moves it and it crushes it and it processes it. It's quite energy intensive and it's not the most efficient business. So one of the challenges we're looking at is when we are actually processing things, how can we basically move the metal, not just the rock? So we're really looking at how we're going to readdress some of the, again, we're calling it the concentrated mine. It's around coarse particle flotation. How can we actually do some of the crushing more efficiently? You know, how can we move less rock but more metal? Water. I'm sure there were lots of sessions looking at the agenda, you know, tackling around some of the resources and how we're using them more responsibly. Water is a key resource for us. You know, water is essentially the most influential resource we have on the planet. It's becoming much more influential than oil. So a lot of our mines, you know, if only we could find mines that were in the middle of nowhere that had, you know, infrastructure and water available. But a lot of our mines are in water stress, in water scarce, or I don't want water rich, watery, waterlogged environments. So water is a big issue that we need to address. I mean, when you're looking at using water for your processing and you're competing with that water supply for agriculture, for urban resource requirements, I mean, this is where significant tensions can arise. So one of the things we're looking at doing is having a waterless mine. You know, think about that. What could that mean? I mean, that could mean you could mine in places where you couldn't have previously mined. It could mean you could do exploration in places. You could be looking at potential stranded resources that were just, it's unthinkable to explore those because of water. So if we're able to manage to solve this issue, then it opens up a whole area and multiple geographies and potential resources to us. The intelligent mine. I know there are jokes about geologists. I can say that I am one. But there are also equal jokes about engineers. So intelligent and engineering, not quite sure. But it's all about data, stupid. I mean, this is the name of the game now going forward. Data, 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 data. How you manage your data, how you store your data, what you do with your data, and it's around taking the data and making the better decisions, becoming more efficient. So again, what we're looking at here is really ensuring that we're being as smart as we possibly can when we're actually undertaking our mining operations and doing our planning and in real time. You know, one of the things you could envisage, you know, in the boardroom, you could actually be able through a terminal to actually look at real time what is going on in the operations. You know, at the moment we couldn't do that, but again, it's all around, you know, just the data and managing it and making sure that your mine is safer, more efficient, you know, your production numbers are stable. So, again, another quick check. Sue hasn't fallen asleep. Gary said he'd already seen this one, so I apologise. I'm sure this is I'm sure you're just like, yeah, oh yeah, I've seen it again. Okay, sorry. That's my transition slide. So that's on the technology innovation, okay? So again, I don't think there's anything sort of radical there. You would be like, oh, well, you're a mining company. You guys should be thinking about this stuff. And we are. And again, this is very much in a response that these are major societal issues that we need to be addressing if we are going to be able to maintain our license to operate and actually just to be able to operate in the future. So, you know, I talked about in my history, you know, I've worked a lot on the non-technical side. Another word for that is around the sustainability space as well. So, you know, I don't think I need to tell anybody in this room that you really need to manage your sustainability issues very well in order if you are to actually fulfill, you know, the dream of finding a resource, taking it through project and actually going into production at a mine level. And here are just, you know, some of the numbers to demonstrate that. I mean, if you look here, you know, here are some of the really significant mines around the world that have been stopped, you know, and we're talking costs of in the billions. So, you know, it's not just from our perspective around innovating around the technology side, we also need to be innovating around the sustainability side of things. But as you can see, you need to draw the two together. So water often is the cause for community unrest or community conflict. So what we're looking to do in Anglo American is really to see the two in concert together. So FutureSmart Mining, TM, really is around the technological innovation, but also thinking around how we are addressing our sustainability challenges in a way that really kind of is making Anglo American the sum of its sort of innovative parts so that we can be a responsible mining company for the future. So what we've done here is we've really taken our sort of sustainable value chain sustainability throughout the whole value chain. So as you can see, sorry, I'm trying to read this and I can't read it, so I have to come up here. So you can really see, you know, looking at the external influences on the top blue line, you have, you know, customer demand, global markets, climate change, biodiversity, you know, all of these big external impacts that we need to be managing. You know, the same here, water, land use, tailings, dust. And then, you know, you have your stakeholders. You know, the stakeholders, you know, stakeholders haven't really changed that much over the years, but, you know, with the onset of social media and the globalization of information, you know, your stakeholder numbers are now bigger. There's nothing you can do now in isolation. So we started thinking around this, you know, very holistically in terms of our stakeholders, our value chain, our issues and impacts. And then we said, well, what are the critical foundations that we need to get right in order to be, you know, to be at this endpoint where we want to get to, which is, you know, a responsible mining house that's going to be the partner of choice for stakeholders and governments in order for them to develop their resources and to be a development partner with them going forward. So again, we started working on our sustainability strategy framework. It's all around operational excellence and, of course, innovation. So again, we need to start working on these three things to really, really develop a much more holistic approach. And in order to do that, we need to change our perspective. Sorry if you've seen that one before as well. But I did laugh at that one quite a lot. So we needed to change our perspective and actually look at the perspective of what others see, okay? So, you know, American geologist view of the US, there you go. And so we went outside, we went external to really kind of engage with a much broader range of stakeholders in terms of understanding, you know, what their views were, what their concerns were, really wanting to understand, you know, how the outside world saw us as a company, saw the mining sector as a sector, and then what their big issues were. So, you know, what were their big concerns going forward as well. And we just saw previously around the Sustainable Development Goals, and of course the Sustainable Development Goals for us were a really key input into starting to formulate our sustainability strategy framework. So again, this is not yet been launched formally. We are working through some of our targets, but I am able to share with you some of this initial framework thinking, just to show you how we as a company are really thinking about the future and what we need to be doing. So you've got, you know, no great revelations here, I don't think. You know, you're talking about thriving communities, trusted corporate leader, and a healthy environment. And within those different bubbles, you can see, you know, things that you would expect a mining company to be working on. But again, for us to be thinking around all of these things holistically actually really helps us put these into our core business activities and our core business processes. We have here the critical foundations. Again, just to talk a bit about those, you've got leadership, zero harm, human rights, diversity and inclusion, our standards, and then our compliance. So again, compliance with legal requirements. I mean, these are all, in some ways, hygiene factors now. You know, a number of years ago, these could have been differentiators or, wow, they're a bit kooky. They're trying to do, like, diversity stuff. But now, these are hygiene factors that companies need to be addressing. So these are the critical foundations, and we really need to get these right. Are we there yet? No, absolutely not. But we are working on it, and there is a real recognition internally that these are core principles that really need to underpin the business activities if we are to meet a lot of the stretch targets and the goals within the sustainability strategy. And there you go, the link with FutureSmart Mining as well. We're developing a lot of the technologies that are going to enable us to meet some of our targets. So, you know, especially around climate change, water, energy efficiency, and also biodiversity as well. And then we can't do this alone. You know, hey, we used to think we could. We totally recognize we can't do it now. So it's now working in collaborative partnerships. So just quickly is talking around engagement. So, you know, so this actually was not necessarily a mining company's view, but definitely an extractive company's view, which was like, I told them what they needed to hear. Okay, and then you wonder why there's people throwing rocks at you. So, you know, we've always been very much about working with our communities, even in our early history. So Ernest Oppenheimer's philosophy was very much around we need to be operating for shareholder value, so for not just for shareholder value, but also for our host communities and countries where we operate. So there's definitely been that ethos that has really been pervasive all the way throughout the last 100 years of Anglo American. And to demonstrate this, we're sort of taking it to a new level. So I think you say, Froydis, yeah, we do community engagement. I know all about that. That's fine, okay? But actually, if you're thinking around how do you take engagement to the next level, what does that look like? I mean, traditionally, engagement with the extractive sector has literally been I will tell you what you need to know. Thank you very much. Aren't you happy that we're here? But of course, as we all know, that doesn't work. It's a much more inclusive discussion and dialogue, and it has to also have a lot more transparency. Now, if you look at the world today, there has been a massive erosion of trust across everybody. So people, I was going to say, did people ever trust corporates? Maybe not. But there is very little trust in corporations. There is very little trust in government. I know there's next speakers from the Financial Times, so I shouldn't say this next bit, but there is waning trust in the media, especially around fake news and things. So who are people trusting? Where are the trusting relationships that can actually provide a dialogue space for people to actually engage and talk to each other in a way that is going to be constructive and not going to come at it with such mistrust? Now, totally recognize that trust requires time. You need to take time to do these engagements. Again, mining sector, they're not very quick, but they do like to, you know, get their project timelines done without recognizing that you need to build trust, especially around stakeholder engagement. And one of the things that we, our CEO, Mark Cutifani, has been very involved in is the faith engagement. So as you can see here is the Archbishop of Cape Town. So, you know, go figure. My CEO, in his diary, he goes to the Vatican to go hang with, you know, Pope Francis. That's in his agenda, and that is a non-negotiable. You know, 3 weeks ago, I was at Lambeth Palace with the faith group engagement with the mining sector. So it's really interesting. I mean, those of you who know the mining sector, you know, Glencore, Ivan Glazenberg is involved as well. So it seems quite incongruous that the mining sector would be, you know, hanging with the church, and it's not just the Catholics. Hey, we're equal opportunities. It's with the Church of England, the Catholic Church, and also the Methodists as well. So this is kind of a new, I won't say a new era of engagement, but there is a real recognition on both sides that the dialogue needs to change, and there needs to be some way to unlock the ability to have a dialogue around the big issues. And so the faith engagement is definitely one of those activities that seems very incongruous, but actually has been yielding a lot of very fruitful dialogue spaces, especially around some of our more challenging operations. We run it's called a courageous conversation, and it damn well is courageous conversation. It's, all the mining companies down in South Africa, getting together and to talk about the big issues. So again, it's just a very interesting sort of evolution of what stakeholder dialogue can look like. The other area that we were looking at is around ethical value chain, and this is something we're kind of grappling with in the mining sector, especially as a lot of the mining companies are now embarking in the trading space. So we're becoming commodity traders. So what does that look like? How do you ensure that you have an ethical value chain throughout your value chain? So from exploration all the way through the value chain, but also then from your supply chain and then into your trading space as well. So there you get into places like the certification discussion as well. So I can talk a bit more about that later on. How do you certify a mine? How do you certify a product? Do you have better coal, responsible steel? All of these types of discussions. Thriving communities, nothing really new there. I mean, our vision is really to ensure that the communities around our operations are obtaining the best excellence in education, enterprise development supports. They're able to participate in our value chain, of which there is significant spend. And then also from a health perspective is to really support the SDG goals of health in the countries where we're operating. Healthy environment, biodiversity, water, climate change. These are the big issues. They are not easy. They require working with different parties, but we do need to start addressing them. So can we have a carbon neutral mine? Is that possible? Can we have our fleet, running on fuel cells or hydrogen fuel cells underground? Can we power the mine through solar panels? Biodiversity, can every single mine now be underground? Can you basically go to look at a mine site and you would not be able to see it? And then water, again, we talked about the waterless mine as well. So when we talk around the FutureSmart Mining, TM, what does that look like from a people perspective? I don't know whether there's been any discussion here around automation. I recently had a very robust discussion around automation and what that means. From my current role in terms of talking to governments, how do we square engaging with governments the value proposition of mining if we're all automated and there are no jobs? These are some of the challenges that we're having to sort of think about and grapple with, as we go forward. We're not there yet, but again, these are considerations we need to be thinking about right now. And so we do some thinking in Anglo around, well, what are the characteristics of the mine of the future? So as you can see here, we've got flat hierarchies. That's hard to swallow for some companies. There's a generational diversity. When I was in the oil sector coming in as a geologist, there was a massive gap between us green newbies who didn't know anything, and then about, the rest of the organization, they were about to retire within 5 years, and there was nothing in the middle because of the way the things had been recruited. So how do we ensure that we don't end up in that potential big train wreck from the resources and the skills and the knowledge? Work-life, again, it's sort of this convergence, especially when we're looking at the millennials coming into the workforce. Value-centered environment, again, just digging and making money and having profits is not necessarily the main motivator for people in their work environment. So how do we ensure that people are in a values-centered organization? And then entrepreneurialism as well. So these are kind of the workplaces of the future and what people need to be considering. And then again, all leaders need to be able to manage networks, not teams. Things are going to be much more virtual. They need to encourage, risk, reward, failure. Again, it goes back to that sort of, fail quick, fail often, get through this. Continuous learning, again, that sort of less arrogant perspective of I don't know everything, therefore I need to continue learning. And then you have to make the purpose of what you're doing quite personal. That's becoming a much bigger thing for people. What's going to get you out of bed in the morning? Is it to dig rock and move rock, or is it going to be something different? And then this was hugely controversial when it was first presented in Anglo American. These are the skill sets that are going to be needed for future GMs. And if you look there, it's much more around being able to talk and engage, do risk assessment, really understand those issues, not just, your production target risk assessments, manage the reputation, and then stakeholder engagement. So these are very much skill sets that we've identified that the workforce of the future really needs to be skilled up in. It's no longer an excuse to be like, oh, he can't talk to the media because he's an engineer. It's not going to cut it anymore. So these are the things that we are thinking around as part of this whole FutureSmart Mining activity within Anglo American. So I think, as we look into the future, that was my last cartoon, if you've still seen it. No. Okay. So I just want to echo, what Helena was saying around, geologists are very much relevant and have a significant role to play in the future of our sector. And again, it's just thinking around the different areas that the mining sector will be moving into, given its response to a lot of these societal expectations. And that goes around technical skill sets as well as all the other kind of skill sets that people need to have if you're to be successful in the industry and working within the context of the industry and what that means and the pressures the industry is going to be facing. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Froydis. Any quick questions? Any bigger issues we can hold over till the Richard?
Yeah, Froydis, I wonder if I could just ask quickly, which is the hardest of the critical foundations to get right?
Oh, good question. Need to go back to them and look at them. I think leadership, to be honest, because you really, it's around people and the culture change and people feeling really that all of these different things that you're talking about are important. So if people are just saying, oh yeah, zero harm is just ticking the box, lip service, diversity, same thing, human rights, same thing, and there's no kind of real ownership of it, you're never going to get to where you need to get to. So I think leadership is critical to enable all of those things.
Great, thank you again. Thank you very much. So it's a great pleasure now to welcome our next speaker, Henry Sanderson, who is Metals and Mining Correspondent at the Financial Times. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So what do I press to get the next slide there? This is it?
This one, it's just the green one to advance.
Got it. Okay, thanks very much. I know I'm even later in the afternoon, so I'm sure you're feeling a bit more tired. I hope what I say is not fake news, and I hope you get something of interest out of it. I just sort of want to take a big picture look at what I see happening in the resource markets and commodity markets, and hope to raise some questions, generate some thoughts. Because I do think we are at a critical moment of transition, and we could very soon, in the next couple of decades, see the end of the oil age. And when you look back at the 20th century, you can see that the influence the combustion engine had on societies, geopolitics, it reshaped cities, led to wars, and really was the dominant the fuel and technology of the 20th century. And if we're coming to the end of that age, what's next? What are we going towards? And I think these transitions often can happen much quicker than people think. And 3 years ago, when I started covering this sector, yes, people were talking about EVs, people were talking about fuel cells, but then now people have really upped their forecasts. And even BHP said to me in Singapore that this year would be the tipping point for electric vehicles. So, I mean, the big miners are saying it themselves. And I really think if we are shifting towards electric vehicles, we're going to see a shift in the resources we use as a society. And it's interesting now that, as I said, the speeds happen very quickly. Now I was talking to Bloomberg New Energy Finance the other day. They're actually hiring oil displacement analysts for the first time. So this shift is happening, but as I said, what to? And I think we need to look at what EVs and renewable energy use. EVs use all these sort of weird and wonderful commodities that perhaps were quite niche a few years ago. But lithium, cobalt, now they're a hot topic. And also cars, they need to be lighter weight. EVs will need to be redesigned to be EVs. They can't just be old cars retooled with a battery. So they're going to use lightweight materials, aluminium, carbon fiber. And I think car makers are going to completely rethink the model. So that will impact commodities. And renewable energy, I didn't mention it here, but it uses a lot of copper, A lot of the wind turbines do use rare earths as well, so that's also a change. As I said, when I started this, analysts were sort of so-so about EVs, but now they've all rapidly upped their forecasts. And that's meant that demand for these niche commodities is due to grow, like lithium, over 20 times through to 2025. And cobalt as well, massive increase. And the real question is whether these markets can meet that increase. And also, what's it going to look like? What are the sort of implications? My personal belief is, China's going to be at the center of this transition. And why do I think that? Because the super cycle really changed the whole outlook for commodity markets, and it meant China's demand is just off the charts. They consume, as you can see here, as a percent of global demand, a huge, huge amount. They're still consuming over 40% of the world's copper. And you can see China, too, is making the shift to EVs in a very rapid way. And this, I think, is very interesting. I took this from a Chinese battery maker, CATL, which aims to be the biggest battery maker in the world. It's just filed for an IPO in China. This is their forecast for China's EV battery production volumes. So they're already the biggest consumer of conventional commodities. You can guarantee they're going to be the biggest consumer of some of these new resources. This is the company I mentioned, CATL. So you can see a lot of Chinese companies in the top. You've got BYD as well, which is the biggest maker of electric vehicles. I'd just like to talk a bit about the implications. I do think the geopolitics is changing. I think people do talk a lot about academic studies that say there's no fundamental shortage. Us at MIT, we've realized there's no shortage. But you've got to remember that resources come from countries, they come from political systems, they come from electorates. And I think there's a couple of implications. For me, going to Chile is a big producer of lithium, and going there's huge amount of political debate about what to do with their lithium resources. One of the biggest producers, SQM, can't even produce more lithium because of a political deadlock there. So that again reinforces to me, yes, you can't just dig up resources regardless of any sort of political structure. I think Australia was a big supplier to China in the super cycle. It's going to continue that role, but it doesn't want to be completely dependent on China. There's a lot of political debate there too. And I also think in Africa we're seeing, like in Tanzania recently, a demand for more value add to be within the countries. And on DRC, Congo, I think there's a massive, massive problem with ethical supply chains and child labor. I know the previous speaker talked about ethical supply chains, but I mean, it is a disaster there, and it needs to be cleaned up for this whole thing to get going. I think batteries are very interesting geopolitically. I showed you the slides about China's massive battery production, but if you look at what people are doing in Europe, in the UK, they want to have homegrown battery production. Maybe it doesn't make sense to transport batteries long distances from China to the West. So that could regenerate regions. I was in Sunderland recently, where the Nissan factory is. They have a big battery production plant there, recently bought by a Chinese private equity company, but they probably will keep it in the UK because they want to service the European market. So you could see a lot of these regions being regenerated. And then longer term, I think it's very interesting that earlier talks about circular economy. I think recycling and reuse in the longer term is critical. I do think at the beginning of my talk I mentioned about oil, if you look at the disasters that came from that, sort of in the Middle East, a whole load of geopolitical problems, does China really want to be dependent on DRC or other countries? Probably not. The absolute ideal is reuse, circular economy. And that does have, I think, big implications. It reduces dependence between countries. If you no longer need to import resources, what's the world going to look like? It's coming at a time when people don't believe in free trade anymore, and we're seeing an effort of reshoring. So I think all these things are going to play into the shifts in the commodity markets. So thanks very much. I'd be interested to hear any questions. Thank you.
questions for now? Richard?
Yeah, Henry, very interesting that you start there to talk about the sort of global markets maybe changing. We sort of were talking about that yesterday. Do you sense that the mining, the resource industry will have to adapt to perhaps a change of the way we supply resources? Are we going to move towards sort of more local market type things then? From what you're saying, you're recycling, but I wondered about the big raw materials. Obviously, geology dictates where resources are found.
Yeah.
But we might have ignored, some resources closer to home that might be the target of future activity if we are becoming more local.
No, I think that's a very interesting topic. I think there is going to be a lot of incentive to develop local resources. I mean, interesting, when I was up in Sunderland, they were showing me, I was in a battery factory, they were keen to say, look, our copper comes from a local company, aluminium comes from a local company, and as much as you can, they want to do that, and that is a huge shift. But you're right, geology is not kind, right? China has 1% of the world's cobalt reserves, and it now produces over 50% of refined cobalt. So how you get over that, I don't know. But I do think there's no point to set up a supply chain where the raw materials moving across the world when you could have the refining and processing in the country where the batteries are made. And in some sense, China is doing that. I think a lot of it will depend also on price, whether they price carbon, whether we move towards that kind of world. Because you think of polluting shipping, right? It's just been free for shipping to pollute the environment. All those costs haven't been borne. So all those supply chains set up in the 80s and 90s, they've been effective because they haven't priced in pollution. So I think that's all going to be quite an interesting question.
On that note, so this is a question or comment both for yourself and for Karen. I've been very heavily involved in European projects looking at the rare earth elements and trying to set the basis for a rare earth elements industry in Europe. And one of those projects, EU Rare, has just finished. We had our last meeting a couple of weeks ago. It was a very small meeting because nearly everybody has left and gone off to work on other projects. And the general consensus was that we weren't going to be able to achieve anything. That although there are rare earth resources in Europe, we're not going to be able to mine them because the markets aren't going to support it. Although we have some processing facilities, the markets haven't even supported them to keep going. So actually they've had to move away from processing the primary rare earth resources. And so it's an interesting question. I think it's the valley of death that Karen spoke about. If we are to achieve that, more local resources, less transport of either the raw materials or the manufactured materials, there's going to have to be some kind of major change, certainly in Europe. I don't know what it is. I'd be interested to know if you guys had any thoughts.
Yeah, I'd be very interested. Obviously, the market is the problem, right? It's got to be cost efficient. But the advantages of having it, I think, are huge. And you've seen the shale revolution in the US. If you look at the geopolitical advantages that's given the US, they're massive. So if you can do it, I think
the only reason
people have
that's
benefits.
succeeded is because they've been able to get those economies of scale. They've done it on a massive scale. They couldn't. That's why shale's never going to be that big here, because we're never going to be able to do it on that scale.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge. I think it is this thing about, we have a model for mining that relies on economies of scale largely. Yeah. And it's interesting having you here saying, well, can we break that? And sort of you're saying, yes, we can. You think, can we break that paradigm about economies of scale?
Yeah, I mean, my point, I agree the raw materials are hard. My point is more that the manufacturing processing could be shifted. And also, if you look at renewable energy, you're not going to transport electricity from a wind farm in China to the UK. We're going to have a wind turbine in Hull or something like that, which means regeneration, which means growth for those communities. Yeah, but I agree, raw materials is tricky.
Yeah. So I'm going to take a comment from Francis and then from Karen, and then we'll move on and hold this over for our panel discussion, so we don't run out of things to talk about now.
I just wanted to comment the idea about the manufacturing shifting is really interesting. But things like a computer chip has got 44 different elements in it, so you're never going to be able to mine everything that you want close to your site of manufacturing. So I think we will have to be transporting things around, and I think it's going to be what's the key commodity that makes you stay in one place, or the bulk things. manufacture everything in the Far East, they've still got to ship it, was an important point.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very interesting point, but it needs quite a lot of thinking about, because the trend is definitely that more and more elements are needed for the manufacturing of high-tech equipment.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Geology is the one factor in it you can't move, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a general comment to this, and you're absolutely right, Francis. I think that it's difficult to do this perfectly, but at the same time, I actually think that there's something to be achieved. And Andrew, just before the break, you were sort of saying this thing that the communities in the UK that traditionally had the mining is not where the wealth currently is, and we're seeing that on a global scale now. We have been happy to let the mining go, put it in China, put it in Congo, put it in Bolivia. We have the industries where the real value addition is happening. And so the people who actually sell the raw materials are getting almost nothing, and the people who are actually manufacturing it is getting a lot. And I think that perhaps to become more sustainable on a global scale, and to get the social license to operate on a global scale, we should get better at integrating the value chain so that the value added actually also happens to some extent closer to where the mining is happening.
I agree. I think if you look at rare earths, I think, Deng Xiaoping said, Middle East has oil, China has rare earths. I think they've thought about it in those terms. They've built up a massive processing industry around their own rare earth resources. But for some reason they've made it work to some extent, right?
Yeah, because they weren't shying away from it and saying, oh, we don't want it.
Yeah.
They were saying we can build the downstream, and this is the problem now. I mean, one of the big, for instance, Greenland projects in rare earths, their plan to go to market is, okay, we'll do the mining here, and then we'll separate it into some heavies and some lights, and all the heavies have to go to China for processing, from Greenland, because it is the only place where they have the technologies and the skills to do it, because they built that and we have let it go. So I think that there's a really big challenge, not just for the rare earths, but in general, in keeping the skills and keeping the value, and also acknowledging that the value starts with the mind, and that we have to make sure that those who take part in that step are getting their fair share.
And I also think recycling could change things, right? If we could recycle our own batteries, we don't need to be dependent on other countries. Maybe, I don't know.
Some of our own batteries.
Yeah.
You need some of them too.
Yeah.
It's a curious place to find yourself in, isn't it? I understand, of course, that to get value as a producer of primary minerals, you have to kind of, as we've been talking about across the 2 days, move up the value chain and do more with those minerals in country. It's very weird that should have to be the case when when the minerals are so needed and are so valuable. But that's the mechanism for doing that, rather than there being another way of doing that, where value accrues in country because it's where the resources are.
There is, and that's just what we did in the 1970s around copper. We tried to, is having countries come together and have commodity cartels. But we've moved away from that from a political perspective globally. We don't allow that to happen. It exists in oil, it doesn't exist in any minerals.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Henry.
you.
As you can tell, you've been thought-provoking. So it's a great pleasure now to welcome Simon Ratcliffe, who is Energy and Cities Advisor at the Department for International Development. Over to you, Simon.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm an architect by training, so hopefully I'm going to give you a slightly different perspective on the issues we've been discussing. Having said that, some of the biggest insights I've had into the way in which the world works have come to me through geologists. And there I can think of people, for example, Colin Campbell and Jeremy Leggett, for example, who were drawing attention to just limits. Well, happen to be limits of our energy stocks, but drawing attention generally to the issue of limits. So I've been a little bit provocative in the title that I've chosen for this, Arches or Beams. So what can we learn from the Romans? There's an arch, that's a beam. So this is also addressing some of the materials and challenges that a lot of you have been articulating during the course of the day. And I'll pick up on some of the points that others have made. The next 15 years, the next decades are going to be dominated by this huge growth in urbanization, this huge movement to cities. And you've had people like Nicholas Stern who've said that, in the next 15 years or so, $90 trillion worth of investment is going to be needed in infrastructure, and roughly equal to the current stock of infrastructure. In other words, we're going to be doubling our current stock in the next, 15 odd years. And this is primarily going to be in rapidly urbanizing cities in developing countries. So cities like Kampala, Kinshasa, are going to be doubling in size, within the next 15 years. And if you've been to either, I think it represents a huge challenge. So what does this all mean? So two things that struck me when looking at this. One is just noting this doubling effect. And the second one is this $90 trillion figure, which is basically a demand-driven projection, hasn't been deconstructed. It hasn't been deconstructed into, well, what does this mean in material terms? How much concrete, how much sand, how much aggregate, how much steel is going to be needed to build $90 trillion worth of infrastructure? And then the question is, do those resources exist, or are they mineable, retrievable within this sort of time frame? So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. How do you calculate doubling times? I'm sure our financial whizzes in the room will give you the answer. That's the rule of 70 divided by the rate of growth. But the important thing is this, that with each successive doubling, that doubling cycle is greater than the sum of everything that preceded it. So if we're going to be doubling the current stock of infrastructure, we're going to be building more infrastructure than we've built in our entire history globally in the next 15 years. Can you get your head around that? I can't. This is, and that's just one of the exponential hockey sticks that we face. And here's just a number of others: population, GDP, loss of tropical rainforest, species extinction, greenhouse gas emissions, water use, ozone depletion, you name it. So here are some of the questions as I see it. Will we have the physical materials to enable the provision of this infrastructure, as I mentioned earlier? What damage will be caused in the process? And here I'm talking about environmental, ecological damage, social damage. What sort of impact on communities will this have? Can we change how we think about the use of materials? And again, that's been the topic of much of the deliberations here today. So what are materials we're talking about? And some of you have alluded to this earlier. These are some recent reports. The media have picked this up, interestingly. Entire islands disappear as violent gangs steal sand amid global shortage. This was in The Guardian earlier in the year. Sand mining, the global environmental crisis you've probably never heard of. And then this is kind of what it looks like. That's in Sierra Leone. Cement, again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, that China consumed in 3 years, between 2011 and 2013, more cement than the US consumed or produced during the entire 20th century. Steel and aluminium. So we produce something like 1,400 megatons of steel and 76 megatons of aluminium a year. So that's about 200 kilograms of steel per person on the planet per year. And that goes with the 400 kilograms of CO2 per person per year emitted in the process. We produce 11 kilograms of aluminium per person per year, which is 5 times more energy intensive than steel. And where does the steel go? You know, over 50% of it goes into the construction sector. Someone mentioned earlier that, you know, compared to agriculture, mining was small fry in terms of its impact on the environment. And if you were to take a helicopter view of the world, which I'm sure many of you have, I think you could verify this. You'll see that the huge scars on the landscape come primarily from agriculture, then cities, and mining a distant third. So this huge urbanization project will over the next couple of decades, will come with huge environmental scars. And we need to be cognizant of that, and we need to see how we can minimize that and how we can, do it better. So coming back to my title, so what can we learn from the Romans? So in my recent wanderings, I was hiking in Asturias in northern Spain last year and walked across this 2,000-year-old Roman bridge. And I'm sure many of you have been to the Pantheon in Rome. For me, it's just, it's absolutely my favorite building on the planet. In Segovia, there's this wonderful aqueduct, and those are the old gates to Cairo, which I was there about 3-4 weeks ago. But these are reinforced concrete beams. So the Romans used to span distances using arches. These days we used reinforced concrete beams. So let's just have a look at the lifetimes of some of these arches. So the bridge in Asturias is about 2,000 years old. The Pantheon's roughly the same, about 2,000 years old. The aqueduct in Segovia is about 2,000 years old, and the city gate to Cairo is over 1,000 years old. This is from the Concrete Society. I don't know if you can see that, but kind of building structures and common structures using reinforced concrete have a life of about 50 years. So just the time frames are completely different, and perhaps there's a clue in there about how we should be thinking differently in terms of time. So someone mentioned earlier that if you take a long-term view, it forces you to think outside the box. Not necessarily saying have Roman timescales, but have considerably different timescales, and see where that takes you. So just a thought, if the Pantheon had been built using reinforced concrete, it probably would have been rebuilt 20 times in order to be still standing today. So if you think about, the materials, the energy, the resources that would have gone into that, there's definitely a better way that we can do and have done so in the past. So the question for this session, as I understood it, was, well, who should we engage with and how? I, with my architectural hat on, would say it's really vital for geologists to be engaging with designers. And who am I talking about there? I'm talking about architects and engineers who understand very little about materials and where they come from and the story of materials. And that's such an important dimension to be inserted into the creation of the built environment. The built environment that we have to maintain, but also the built environment that we've yet to build. I think people would be building and designing very, very differently if they knew the story of materials. And how you do that, how you go about doing that, I think is a question for you to answer. But you know, one route would clearly be through the universities and having geologists absolutely integrally involved in the training of designers. So, you know, the question I have, I don't know if any of you have been to the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, you know, magnificent building, awe-inspiring building, but using vast quantities of titanium in the roof. And, you know, the question I have is, would Frank Gehry, who designed it, have done so if he'd known the story of titanium, if he'd seen the beaches that had been wrecked in the process? Would he have, you know, is that what he would have specified? Just some thoughts.
Thank you very much. Again, do you have a little time for questions? Richard, you surprised me with a question.
Well, as a comment, we should get rid of white paint first. I think there's more titanium in white paint than in the Guggenheim Museum.
Yeah.
Well, I thought the Pantheon was made of concrete.
Yeah, it is made of
The
concrete.
Romans invented.
Yeah,
Their
but it's not
concrete must
made
be
of
better than ours.
It's made of concrete, but not of reinforced concrete.
Right. So
It doesn't have steel in it.
That's the key, isn't it?
Yeah, well, concrete and steel are two sort of incompatible materials because concrete is porous and steel corrodes.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, but there are plenty of reinforced concrete structures that are much older than 60 years around.
Yeah,
Like viaducts, that's not.
yeah. No, there are, but you know, how safe are they? And you know, you can up the standard of building, and you could probably extend it to about 100 years if you build and specify very, very carefully.
I mean, I think you look at, you know, we ought to be looking at making these structures last longer.
Yeah.
Not completely. You know, there are huge advantages to building the way we do now compared to the way the Victorians built. You know, they were using stone and bricks and cast iron, and the sort of efficiencies we can get now are huge. It's just that we tend to build things and then knock them down too quickly. We don't build things that last.
I think there are ways of designing that you could design the steel out of the reinforced concrete, but in a way that you can replace it. So it still fulfills its tensile function, but design it differently. And that's all I'm really saying. So design it differently so that it has a different time frame. Edmund.
I think arguably the greatest industrial polluter, the industry which is adding more carbon dioxide to our atmosphere, is the cement industry. Coming back to your point, the Pantheon, built by the Romans, has got pozzolanius cementum. It's a lower energy manufacture. I think that the point that Simon is making is that if you are going to think about how much material you're going to lock up in this urban infrastructure and reduce CO2 levels, how do we do that if we're going to use all of that cement? There's an incompatibility. So somewhere along the way, we do have to be a little radical about expectations in terms of this new urban environment. And although I see a lot of advantage of steel, reinforced steel, high-rise buildings, I'm not sure that can sit alongside some of the other things that we want to do.
If I could just add to that, I was looking at a carbon budget calculator, which was looking at how long we still have to meet, within the carbon budget that we have, to meet a 1.5 degree global warming target. It's 8 months.
I don't want want to encourage consumption to produce more reinforced concrete, because I know a few things. One of them is that lifetime reinforced concrete and the specified life of buildings in Southeast Asia is less than 50 years, it might be 30 years in Singapore. And one of the critical things to bear in mind, of course, is that those buildings, when they are demolished, they are a resource. They're a resource in steel, they're a resource of course, concrete and secondary aggregate. But above all, the fines, if you like, the material that you can't sell or something else, it takes carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere, and you can demonstrate that. So those buildings recover a proportion of the carbon that was driven off when the limestone was calcined. I look at these war zones on the television news with horror, but at the same time I look at them and think there's some fantastic carbon capture that can go on there. and that's something which helps us close that circle a little bit.
Well, and I think, again, just going back to the point about design, I think increasingly we're going to have to learn how to design buildings and what have you in a way that you can deconstruct them and use the components and materials in other, in other ways.
I've been told that demolition contractors will pay to demolish a building because they see it as a quarry, which is a very interesting way of looking at it as well. You don't have to pay a demolition contractor if you've got the rights of the building.
One last point from Richard, and then we're going to move on to the next
Well,
one.
I think we are, coming back to what Edmund was saying, and clearly what he's saying, we are being driven towards that. We've been doing a lot of reconstruction at the Natural History Museum. Actually, we've got a Victorian building that's going to last forever because it's steel frame and they just hang things on the outside. And it's all our 1970s buildings that have the problem. But the legislation is there to make sure that you reuse buildings. So, for example, our new planning, we have to we get credits for using a certain percentage of the recycling in the materials that we've got in the old buildings. And I think there's definitely the building regs in London are very much driving you towards careful thought of what you build buildings of. And I think we are moving away from using reinforced concrete. We're seeing a lot more buildings that are clad, you build a steel frame and you clad it so it can be deconstructed and recycled, because there's definitely a benefit, legislative benefit of doing that. So I think people are embracing that, and probably just got to get better at it.
Kind of small scale needs to become much more mainstream.
Okay, one final comment.
Yes, sorry, a very quick one. I talked a little bit this morning about disaster reconstruction. I mean, the core concept that was presented in this talk is essentially what we're trying to do with reconstruction after Irma at the moment. So instead of having a concrete block house with tin roof, corrugated iron roof, we're looking at pillarless clay brick archways that will provide a more stable reconstructed house and can be used from clay brick local materials. And there you've got very, the durability of that into the future. Earthquakes and hurricanes is much greater. So we're not just talking about the building of cities. Remember, most of the things that are going to be built in the developing world are very simple kind of structures.
And all of those buildings are going to be filled with stuff.
Indeed. And I think, there's some really interesting discussion there. I think we absolutely, well, I certainly do, take the point that, whatever debates around the particulars of are we doing this or how well are we doing this, the message that geologists could be and should be engaging more with designers, with architects and so on, I think is a really important idea, because, I just don't think that really is at the root of the system at the minute. We have one last talk before we go for a quick cup of tea and then back for a bit more discussion. It's a great pleasure now to welcome Thomas Evans, who is a senior researcher at Policy Connect, a think tank. Thanks, Tom.
Hi, thanks. Hello, so my name's Tom, and I'm from a think tank called Policy Connect. So to be frank, straight up, I am not a geologist. I don't do anything to do with mining, and a lot of the topics that discussed today are really fascinating, but definitely not something I'm too heavily involved with. The reason I'm here today is because, like I said, I'm from a think tank, and what we do is essentially try and get these sort of discussions in Parliament. And I kind of just want to share some reflections on how we can start to get policymakers on board with kind of the themes that we've discussed today. And when I say policymakers, I really do mean MPs and peers, pretty much, because I think these are the sort of conversations which they might be being had in Whitehall, they might be being had in the business community by NGOs, but I personally don't see much of a conversation around all of this in Parliament. I work on climate change, so my background is in energy research and low-carbon energy heating specifically. And even on that, there's very little political engagement. So yeah, that's kind of the focus of my talk. So there's just 3 parts. Firstly, I'll talk a bit about the think tank I work for and how we work. And I only do that to kind of introduce some of the ideas which I'll raise in the second part of the talk, which is about how we can actually capture the attention of Parliament on this issue. And then finally, just some takeaway actions. Hopefully some of what I talk about today is of interest or use. So yeah, how does Policy Connect work? So we're a think tank. We've been around for 20 years or so. Unlike a lot of other think tanks, we don't have an ideological position and we don't take a party political position. So we call ourselves the cross-party collaborative think tank. So we're not left-wing or right-wing. Everything we do, we try and engage both Labour and Conservative politicians, and ideally beyond that to kind of get Lib Dem and SNP and other smaller parties involved. And the way we do that is by providing a platform to have discussions in Parliament with business community, civil society, and academia, primarily. One of the main platforms we use in Parliament to have a conversation is something known as an all-party group. Some of you might be familiar with them, other people might not. So an all-party parliamentary group is an informal association of MPs and peers who join together to discuss policy areas of their interest. So I'm the manager of the all-party parliamentary climate change group. So that's chaired by Caroline Lucas MP, the leader of the Green, well, co-leader of the Green Party. And we've got about 20 or so different MPs who regularly engage with us on this topic, again, from all the main parties. And I work with them, essentially, to drive climate change policy up the political agenda. So what do they do? All-party groups largely focus on holding meetings in Parliament. So there's over 550 different all-party groups in Parliament, and they range from all manner of subjects. So obviously I work on the climate change one, and at Policy Connect we have ones on manufacturing, education and skills, health, and carbon monoxide poisoning. But, I mean, there are ones to do with basketball, baseball. There are also ones to do with, I think there's one on international mining, when I was kind of looking up some background before I did this talk. But they're very informal groups. They're not officially sanctioned by kind of Parliament, but they are, I think, quite influential. It's one of the few chances that parliamentarians have to come and sit down and talk about issues which aren't necessarily very high up the political agenda. And there's a chance for them to talk across party lines. And ultimately, it's a chance for them to get people from outside of Parliament in front of them and have discussions which aren't really had otherwise. So yeah, we use all-party groups to capture the attention of Parliament. And I think kind of there are three aspects of our work when we try and do this. So the first is building a coalition. I think the key thing about getting the attention of Parliament is that they're very busy people. They are incredibly busy in terms of getting them to even pay attention to you for half an hour. That can be like a massive challenge. They'll often cancel, they'll often rearrange their schedules around you. It's a lot of work just to get your foot in the door. And I think increasingly there's also a lot of hesitance around going in there just from one angle, so for instance, the climate change in the green groups have a huge presence in Parliament, but a lot of people on especially different sides of the political spectrum have some hesitance towards engaging with them because it doesn't naturally fit their approach to things, and they want to see a more balanced conversation, or they want to see kind of the big industry players in the room as well as the people speaking out for kind of smaller issues. So the way we do things is we always take the approach of building a cross-sector approach. And again, it kind of points to what previous speakers were talking about in terms of getting, bridging traditional gaps in these challenges in order to raise awareness of them. I don't think, I think there's just a huge amount of value in doing that. I mean, the example I give there is just a piece of work my colleagues currently undertaking about flooding and sustainable housing. And the government wants to build many more houses. So we've kind of teamed up with water companies as well as people like NGOs like the WWT in order to have a bit of a balanced and well-rounded conversation. It's not just one company, it's not just one side of of the argument. And in doing that, we try and argue that a more consensual-based approach to some of these issues is kind of the first step to actually pushing forward a discussion on it. So building a coalition, and then secondly, getting the right people in the room. So there's 650 MPs in Parliament, and then many more Lords. But I think not all of them are going to care about this issue. Like I said, I work on climate change stuff, and we maybe get about 20 people out of the 650 to regularly pay attention to it, in our work at least. And of that, the vast majority of them are from parties other than the Conservative Party, to put it bluntly. The Conservative Party do engage on it, but it's tougher. So and I think the reasons that people engage in it are for three core reasons. The first one is current affairs. People will pay attention if it is relevant to you right now, or relevant to the world right now. And I don't even mean that in the context of kind of big policy documents that are going right now, like the industrial strategy, or like the clean growth strategy. To kind of use a really silly example, even a documentary, well, it's a big documentary, but Blue Planet 2 is genuinely causing parliamentary debate. And one of the MPs I'd worked closely with, Barry Shim, an MP, actually had a debate in Westminster Hall on marine degradation and the UK's role in it. And every single MP who spoke mentioned Blue Planet 2, and that's the reason why they were there. And it's kind of silly, but that's just the way politics works. Like people, I think the Chancellor in his speech the other day was like, oh, everyone's watching Blue Planet 2, and it's like, great, okay, well, if that's what it takes to get you paying attention to this issue, you have to ride off of that. So yeah, the first aspect of what motivates a politician to act on something is just what's going on right now. And then more cynically, there are two other factors, I think. The second one is constituency. This comes up time and time again in terms of how we approach people to work with. If it affects their voters, they will, or they are more likely to pay attention. And if they're in a really small marginal seat, they will almost definitely pay attention. I think the latest elections really shown that a lot of MPs are in really fragile positions in terms of their voters. And some MPs are only devoting their attention to voter and constituency issues, and they really don't have time to pay attention to kind of global issues or issues which aren't as urgent in their mind. So, often it just takes looking at a map to work out where your key MPs are. And then finally, their career. It's a bit cynical, but it's true that a lot of MPs will only engage on something if they see it benefiting themselves. They would never admit that, I don't think, and it's maybe a controversial for me to say it outright, but it's true. Most MPs in Parliament are there to have a career, and they one day want to be in government, they one day want to be a minister, and if they're not a minister, they want to be a shadow minister, and if they're not a shadow minister, they want to be on a select committee, and if not on a select committee, they at least want to be on the way to being on a select committee. So it's all about MPs trying to develop their reputation, their leadership on an issue. And you see this all the time. MPs will take a really vocal stance on an otherwise unappreciated issue, and they become the leading authority on it. And then quite quickly, they're known in Parliament and by their peers and colleagues as the go-to person on campaigning for air quality or food waste. And so those three factors, I think, kind of come to mind when I think about, how do you get the right people working with you on an issue like mineral resources and the mineral resource challenge. Let's get that slide. And then finally, once you've kind of got a coalition of people and you've got this cross-party, cross-sectoral approach, and once you've found the right people to work with, it's actually about being in Parliament and doing parliamentary things. I think this is somewhere which a lot of parts of society who are campaigning for an issue don't do this very well. And when you do it well, it can be really impactful, and it's only through, I think, actions like these that you really start to get it up the political agenda in a meaningful way. Obviously, select committee inquiries are probably the most well-known form of engaging in Parliament, but ultimately, select committee inquiries often reflect what is going on in the world rather than pushing policy into a new area. So they will take an issue like marine plastics, which is high up the agenda, and do an inquiry on that and then push government to do something. But for issues which aren't necessarily at that level, there are also things called Westminster Hall debates and parliamentary questions, and these are really vital tools, I think, in capturing MPs' attention. for example, yeah, the circular economy. So at Policy Connect, we run the all-party group on sustainable resources, which looks at waste issues, and it looks at issues like remanufacturing and the circular economy more broadly. A Westminster Hall debate is a 90-minute, an hour-long debate led by MPs, and it automatically guarantees a minister will be present because the minister has to make a response to the issue. And this is one we had earlier this year. We essentially helped organise it, and we tried to get MPs in the room for it. And this is just a quote I took because we actually managed to get the minister to read a report that some of my colleagues had written on remanufacturing and the triple win, the environmental, economic and social benefits of remanufacturing. So that's one way in which these issues get up the agenda. And the second one is through written questions. So all MPs are entitled to write questions to the government has to respond. The government responses are often incredibly vague, and that's deliberate, and civil servants are taught how to do that. But I only bring this one up because this is something that I've been working on, which is low carbon gas, and looking at gases like hydrogen and biomethane and what role they might play in decarbonising the UK heating sector. And this MP, Callum McCaig, he lost his seat in the last election, unfortunately. But we worked with him on an inquiry I just published in September about hydrogen, and he can ask these sort of questions of government, and government has to start then thinking about it. And over time, through this sort of concerted effort, you really do start to see government kind of paying attention. So it was quite a quick talk. I didn't want to go on too long at this kind of time of day. But really, I think, in terms of getting this agenda spoken about in Parliament, I think that not the only way it's going to happen, and it probably does happen to some small extent, but to see it happen on a level which is kind of proportionate to the scale of some of the challenges that's been spoken about today. I think the first step of building a coalition, I don't know kind of what sort of cross-sectoral working goes on in your area, but I'm almost certain it does exist. Building a strong coalition, something my chief exec at Policy Connect always talks about. His name's Jonathan Shaw. He used to be an environment minister in a Labour government. And he always says, the first thing people do when they see an invitation to something, or when they get invited to a meeting, or when they look at a report published by someone, is not what's in it, but who was writing it, who was funding it. And if it just says one company, they probably just go, well, this is a piece of lobbying. If they see it's got a huge amount of support across the sector, that's when they start to kind of get a bit more buy-in, and they start to see it's a bit more of a unified voice in what can be a really divisive debate. Once you've built the coalition, I think getting the right MPs in the room is absolutely critical, and finding the parliamentary champions to push forward your work. And then finally, engaging and actually getting heard in Parliament. I make it kind of sound straightforward or quick. I mean, it's really not. It's something I do every day, and it takes all this work, and it's often very unrewarding because change is slow, and at a time like today when everyone's thinking about things like Brexit, and it's a difficult place to work, but I think it's really important to have that political conversation. This is obviously just one part of a much wider conversation that needs to be had with policymakers, and obviously this is just one part of a global conversation, but I do think it's kind of a critical part, and once you build that political capital and build that political momentum, I really hope we can probably see a lot of progress. So that's what I had to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. Questions?
I was struck by your very first comment there, that we could just kind of skip all that and just produce a blue LN. I mean, but that kind of brings on to the issue that the mining industry is really terrible at communication still, I think. I mean, it's gotten better, but I don't know if this is a kind of a question or somebody else wants to answer. It's like how do we improve that image through means, that millennials are interested, which is, engaging videos and stories. All we have now is, this Matthew McConaughey story about Bryan, which is like awful, and some really awful reality TV programs. We need something better.
I mean, I definitely don't have the solutions to that question. It's incredibly hard. I always think about, when we approach a topic, we always see it through kind of the widest possible lens. So you're right in saying, yeah, it can't just be about, and I think like every sector kind of is aware of that if you want to talk about a challenge like, I mean, food waste is one I've worked on quite recently, so it always comes to mind. If you want to talk about a challenge like food waste, people are concerned about it because it's bad for the environment. But increasingly, the messaging that goes along with that, and the one we used to engage MPs with, is it's bad for people's wallets. It's bad at a time when people are really budget constrained in time of austerity. It's important we take action on this in order to save, in order to make your households and your constituency better off. It's those different lenses which you can see an issue through. Whether that's gender, whether that's diversity, socioeconomic inequalities, moral leadership. It's surprising, actually, in the election, a lot of issues came up which aren't big issues like ivory. And like just now, there's a lot of debate about this animal sentience vote they had in Parliament the other day. That's an issue which I've never heard anyone talking about in a big way. But it comes up in the political agenda because it relates into these broader things. Like the animal sentience just comes in the context of Brexit and this context of government pushing through things in a way that isn't necessarily, or at least perceived by some, to not be kind of helpful to a Brexit. So, yeah, that's my thoughts on it. But I mean,
and I'm going to ask you to repeat that question then when we get into the discussion session, because I think that question around how we communicate and who we're needing to communicate with is at the heart of the theme of the session and what we want to come back to in 15-20 minutes. Francis.
So how is Policy Connect funded? How do you get the money to do what you do?
So the way we run, so Policy Connect itself isn't funded. We have, so for example, I manage the All Party Climate Change Group, and we're funded by 55 different sponsoring organisations. So that's part of kind of building a coalition. We don't want to be funded by just one voice. And in doing that, we try and get a really wide range of sponsorships. So the Climate Change Group is funded by everyone from Shell through to Greenpeace. And that broad church is how we have, firstly, political weight, because we're not coming at it from one issue. And yeah, I mean, the money. And we're not for profit. It's challenging.
We're not wishing to put anyone on the spot here or try and conduct any sort of negotiation with you in public, but if we decided in our session in the next hour, one of the things we want to do is set up an all-party parliamentary group, do the sort of thing you're talking about, would it be a matter of putting together the coalition, we come to Policy Connect and you'll say, fine, we'll do that? Do you select the causes you'll work on?
In terms of why we run the all-party groups we do, I think that's a good question. A lot of them are just so we've been going for 20 years, and our founders kind of took these on. The Climate Change Group is one we took over from a different secretariat because they no longer wanted to do it, and we thought we could, and it fits within the sustainability team's remit. But to set up an all-party group, you just need the MPs. So you need to find, because the group itself is the collection of MPs and peers. And from there, yeah. But yeah, I mean, like I said, there's an APG for everything. I really can't think of something that doesn't have an APG. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think we'll break for tea now. So we have a final discussion session, which, according to our timetable, I think I said we'd finish by 5, but I'm going to aim to finish by 4:45, because I know that some people want to get away and people won't want to kind of feel that desperate pull between wanting to stay for the conversation and leave. People, of course, will welcome to hang around and talk amongst themselves after that, but we'll finish at 4:45. And if you need to pop out before, I don't know quite what your departure time is when you need to go. If 4:45 is looking too late.
I think you told me that was good. I'll trust
I
you
think
on that.
4:45.
Yeah.
I think it'll be fine as long as you're quick out once we go. So I think, I mean, we know what the framing is for this session generally. Rather than reflecting on the talks we've had at this stage, I think it would be useful to focus on one or two questions. I've got a huge list of questions that I've picked up over the last couple of days that I wanted to focus back in on, but there's three that I'd like to really pick up Certainly happy to take other questions from the floor as well. And then I want to have a bit of a chat about sort of outputs, next steps, what we might actually do, so that we haven't all just got together and had a lovely couple of days all talking and nothing really changes or moves forward. So if I could just kind of put my first couple of questions out there, and these are partly as well come from discussions that I've had with people. One is, in the UK, we've had a lot of attention paid recently, perhaps unexpectedly, to industrial strategy. We now have an industrial, well, we will on Monday, I believe, have an industrial strategy in the UK, but we know quite a lot of what is in it. I don't think it's going to be very different to the green paper that came out earlier in the year, but the white paper will be out on Monday. There's been, in tandem with that, some real changes to how science and innovation are funded, restructuring of the research councils, bringing them together with Innovate UK, the Industrial Challenges Research Fund, and so on and so on. So there's real attention apparently being paid to industrial strategy, industrial development in all sorts of ways, albeit in the UK context. The industrial strategy does not mention raw materials. It doesn't actually seem to recognise any constraints on where the resources are going to come, the physical resources are going to come from to address these issues, to make the UK's economy thrive, and to thrive in a post-Brexit era, which I think is an interesting position to be starting from, and I wonder what we do about that. So that's maybe a sort of reframing of the question that we got a bit of a view on from Tom just before the break about how do we engage policymakers, because there's a real reason to engage policymakers. What can we park around that? Another one which I've just been talking with Francis about and that has come up in other settings as well is whether here we're talking about one challenge because we're better off thinking about the minerals challenge of the future holistically, or whether we're actually talking about two or more challenges, which can sometimes be in tension and sometimes have synergies, and when it's sensible to think about one challenge and when it might be sensible to think about two challenges, particularly that we've got this, the sort of the narrative of the EU critical metals, critical materials idea, which is focused on the sort of high-tech future technologies, decarbonisation, all of those sorts of things, and then this quite different set, albeit with overlaps, where you're looking at building needs, development materials, and so on. And then the third one is the point that Dylan raised just before the break as well, about communicating, how we communicate, to who we're communicating, what sort of values we're playing into. And that, I think, as well, is probably key to this sort of overriding question which we've got in the, that we'd set out in the programme about who do we enlist in this effort and how. So are those helpful starting points for some comments? Henry?
No, I just wanted to pick up on the industrial strategy. So, we've got the Faraday Challenge, which actually is the most, I was told, is the most amount of money in the industrial strategy will go towards batteries. And I think you raise an interesting point, why don't they concentrate on raw materials? And this is my guess about it, which is that everyone in the UK for the last 20 or whatever years has a mindset that we can only do technology and IP and research, and we've got these great universities, but we can't manufacture at scale. So I think the Faraday Challenge is saying, look, let's have battery technology, generate the IP, but then we'll license it to someone else to do the manufacturing. But I think, I don't know, but I think it'd be interesting to think differently about, can we manufacture at scale in the UK? And I think the one thing the Gigafactory did, just changing that mindset about they can manufacture at scale in the US, get the cost down, supply their own market. That's just my guess, but I wonder if they're thinking in that way. And I went to see a company, Hyperdrive, which is in Sunderland, and they also think in that way. They're taking sort of batteries and then designing a battery management system, coming up with the IP, and then they'll license that to others, because they think we can't compete at scale with the Chinese others. But I don't know, that's part of it.
Any other? Froydis, any thoughts?
On that specific piece?
Any of the stimuli that I've put out there, or anything else that you wanted to comment on?
I'm probably not the best place to talk around the sort of UK industrial strategy in more specifics. I do agree with you, there's a sort of deficiency on the raw materials. One of the things we are looking at is around the mobility piece. Not only do our products go into the low carbon mobility sort of area, it's also looking, if they are looking at doing low carbon mobility, there are some of our products that will not be being used. So we're trying to work through that in terms of what will be used, how we can position ourselves, how we can gear up, those types of things. The one area I would like to reply to you back, Dylan, is on the how do you position mining and things. I remember when I first worked in oil and gas, I was a geologist, I was on the rig, that was quite specific, you're on the rig. People understood that, más o menos. And then when I came to work in my job in the mining sector, people were like, I don't understand what you do. And it was just after Avatar came out. So all of a sudden there was like, oh yeah. So in Avatar, do you do like that Sigourney Weaver character stuff, yeah? And that was honestly how I could relate to people about what I did in terms of community relations. And all of a sudden the penny dropped, they're like, oh, right, okay, but mining's really bad, right? So just like Thomas was saying, the blue planet sort of factor, you have something like the movie Avatar, and then the Matthew McConaughey film, there is this kind of negative sort of the reinforcement of the negative stereotype that mining has. And this is one of the things that I think we all are not struggling with, but we are constantly striving almost to demonstrate the societal value that we bring in what we do. We don't just dig big holes and cause massive impacts. Mining is very different now to how it was 100 years ago. The mine of the future will be even more different. And it's how do we articulate that and our vision and to bring people along with that to get them on board. And I think the faith group engagement, again, was a real kind of aha moment for them, because, again, they had these sort of ingrained stereotypes. And a lot of the church groups were anti-mining because of a lot of their constituents, especially in developing countries, were feeling that they would be negatively impacted and they were kind of being targeted, and this was really inappropriate. It was a real social justice issue. And then when we started engaging with the church and we actually took them to mines and we took them to sites and we actually were with them and talking to the communities where, again, because where we're operating from a development world perspective, there's a lot of, I won't say failing states, but oftentimes we have to stand in for, some of the sort of state infrastructure, whether it's housing, water, education, healthcare. And the way we approach that in a collaborative way, and then when people actually look at how we are working with the communities, these faith leaders who were on this trip, or these various trips with us, it was multi-company, multi-geography, all of a sudden they just had this completely different reframed view of what mining does. So again, it's very easy to bash mining. We're kind of like the easy whipping boy. And so again, we just have to work doubly hard all the time to just break even in some ways, that we're demonstrating we're not always doing a negative, if you see what I mean. So again, we're working really hard, I think, doing this broader engagement and demonstrating the value. And then, of course, the real area is around getting third-party advocates to actually say, journalists say, don't tell me how great you are, let somebody else tell me, because then, I can sort of cross-check that as another source. And so one of the things we are continually trying to do is to work with all these different stakeholders in a collaborative way, and then also ensuring that these stories and these messages and what we are doing are actually being articulated. And I think we as a mining sector have, again, it's the same in the oil and gas sector. It's run by a bunch of engineers or finance guys whose idea of PR is just to give a big scientific dossier and go, there you go, you work it out how great we are. There's none of this kind of subtlety. So I think there is now a much better appreciation in the leadership level that you have to be engaging on what we do and not just assuming that everybody knows how fantastic we are or how fantastic we think we are. So it's a constant battle, but I think there is a bit more of a change. But again, sorry, I'm talking too long about it, but there's another onus coming onto us, especially with the high tech. I mean, the FT had the article yesterday around the child labour in the... Yeah, two articles, sorry. It was a great article. But again, it's people who buy the iPhone do not want to have that social conscience around that product that they've bought. They are expecting the people who are manufacturing it and then further down the supply chain to kind of make sure it's all clean and ethical, because the consumer does not want that responsibility. So again, there's a lot more scrutiny now on us as companies to ensure that our products and as well as our supply chains are becoming much more ethical, and we're actually ensuring that we are really pushing down a lot of what we believe further down the supply chain, which is hard, really hard. And this is one of our big challenges now at the moment as well.
Which brings us back to what Francis was talking about this morning with responsible sourcing, and
exactly.
certainly put front and centre in my mind the idea of manufacturers, of the downstream industrial consumers of the mineral resources as an important part of the coalition we need to build to address these challenges. Edmund and then Karen.
Well, picking up that idea that Tom left us with about building a coalition. One of the successes, I think, of the past couple of days has been to bring together in a single meeting people who are outside of the geological community. And for this society, I think that this event is atypical, if not unique, in that it's gone out of its way to engage with others. Because if we think that there is a problem, no one community, no one area of expertise is going to solve it. So that's just an initial thought. I think that there is a fundamental challenge which we face, and that is getting our decision makers to actually recognize something of the consequences of their actions. Now, I am not suggesting for a moment that it is not a good thing that there are sustainable development goals and there is the Paris Agreement. But I would suggest to you that all of those who put their name to either probably didn't give a moment's thought to where the necessary raw materials are going to come from. So there is an educational activity to be done at that highest level, which in the end means that we have to work with policy advisors. And there is a big challenge about raising awareness generally within the population who are the consumers of all of this. Now, although the society is more than 200 years old, that is a bigger challenge than we, on our own, can take on. So I think we do need to continue this engagement with others, to find what it is that we uniquely can bring to this conversation, and also to recognize the input of others. So that's my take-home message. Now, in that, we need to work with industry, but in a way that preserves the independence of the society and is not perceived to be an advocate for industry. But we also need to work with NGOs and all that area of, civil society which has an interest there. We need to work, even post-Brexit, with the European Union in some way. I do not know how, but I don't think we'll be shut out. I don't think the door will be closed on us. And we do have something to add to this conversation. And we also need to work with other audiences internationally. And without overdoing it, this meeting was seen to be a precursor to the event in Vancouver. And there is an opportunity, potentially, to take some of the messages, the outputs of this meeting, to that event, which hopefully will have an audience of about 4,000 across minerals, water, energy, but deliberately with an emphasis on younger people, the decision makers of tomorrow, because that probably is the bigger audience to go after and what in the longer term will be most influential. They're just some thoughts.
What he said.
Oh dear.
No, I think that I can only agree with everything that everyone is saying. I think that the lack of mentioning of raw materials is showcasing this staggering ignorance still that that people have about raw materials, and it never ceases to surprise me. But I actually do think that it is changing, is moving in the right direction. But I think that the awareness creation, it cannot be underestimated, and I totally agree. It's with policymakers, but it's also the policymakers of the future that are going to be very important. And I think, for instance, for the mining, I think that there's been maybe sort of traditionally, or back in historic times, there's been perhaps a tendency that mining companies were sort of best, not being in the news was good. So flying,
that's a win.
Yeah, flying under the radar was probably a good thing. And I think that it really is time. I think that we are sort of in a shift of times, a paradigm shift. I think it really is time for the mining industry and everyone else in the industry, downstream as well, to really kind of like, here we are. We will give you the green transition. We will give you those batteries that you need. But we will also provide you with the understanding that if you want an electrical vehicle, or if you want a computer with a battery that lasts for 24 hours, then you have these things in it. And I actually think the consumer is almost ready, because I think we are seeing that we want the we want the organic milk and the local fruit. We're starting to have that very aware consumer that is willing to pay more to know that things have been done in a way that they can support. And I think this is also coming to raw materials. And I actually just very recently went in to buy a Fairphone online, and I couldn't even order it online. I couldn't even make a back order, because it's so popular now that people want that concept. And so I think that I think the times are changing, and I think we really have to keep the focus on that, and also start to change this this misunderstanding that raw materials is not relevant to us because it's all about IP or .coms or this. It's something else that makes us make the money, and people don't realize that raw materials actually go into pretty much everything. So we continue to do that.
I mean, who knew, right? Who'd have guessed? So I'm going to go out to the audience, and David had already caught my eye, and then I'll invite other comments from the audience.
Thank you. It was always good to catch Nick's eye. I'd like to ask the panel, we're on a journey, and the journey didn't start today. We've been en route for a little while, in many ways, maybe 200 years. But the thing which is on my mind is that a couple of years ago, we produced Geology for Society as a statement. Perhaps it's already been overtaken by events. We've got the Vancouver meeting as the next service station on this journey. Does the panel think that we could work on what went into Geology for Society and similar documents to come up with a very, very clear statement of how the SDGs and what we might call geology relate to one another, broadening it out to recognise the food, water, energy, minerals, all the things which we take for granted and have discussed in this meeting today, some kind of mapping. Is that feasible? Is it something we should do?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I think the SDGs provide you with this kind of framework. I mean, some people say, oh, you can do anything to the SDGs, but these are actually really interesting, concepts that are in one place that you can actually really attribute what you do to it. So, are we under Chatham House rules here?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't know what that is, so I'm not.
Don't worry. But you are.
Sean from Chatham House has gone, but we're still under Chatham House.
Well, this is not super controversial, but we still dig coal, right? So we have a big coal business. Are we going to get rid of that anytime soon? No. So we are a coal producer, but we need to tackle climate change in a big way. How do you make how do you make these two things come together? And of course, again, it goes back to sort of reputation standpoint. The oil industry say, hey, we love that you produce coal because you guys make us look good, okay? But we were actually sitting down with our coal CEO, and this is a big, he's an operator, big time operator. SDGs, yeah, okay, fine, that's something. Explain to me what they are. And we went through it, and all of a sudden, the penny dropped for him, and he was like, holy cow, coal, through the production of electricity, enables about 6 of the SDGs. So it was really interesting. So for him, it helps him actually articulate the value of coal in a way that isn't just we need to give, cheap electricity to people. It's the kind of follow-on piece of it. We still have a problem to kind of square the circle around, I've forgotten what is SDG climate change, but that's something that we're kind of working on. But I think, mapping things to the SDGs and the benefit of the natural resources and geology and where the resources are, I think is something that does, we found, really resonate with the next generation coming through.
I can have a little Blue Peter moment here and say, here's one I prepared earlier, because you'll be pleased to hear, David, there is a draft Geological Society briefing note on geology and the SDGs, which Flo and Joel Gill of Geology for Global Development wrote, and which is sitting in my inbox waiting for me to have a look at it and get it kind of squared up and out there. And my good excuse for not having done that for ages, which Flo's been very cross with me about, is that I'll be able to revise it in the light of this meeting that we've had. But I think very soon we'll get such a briefing note out, and as you say, build on those.
Can I just comment on this?
Please.
I mean, there is, and I think someone mentioned it earlier, but there is an atlas of how raw materials play into the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that we need to build more on that. And I think actually, like I said when I was speaking, I sort of love waving my arms and saying we need to build a better world. And that's easy to say, but it's actually this sort of implementation. What is it pragmatically we need to do, each of us and each of the companies, or as a society, or as a group, to actually make sure that we are moving things in the right direction. And I think that conversation is extremely interesting. And I think that is the conversation where it is really important that there are geologists, because for instance, the circular economy, which is being abused by so many. There was the Danish government actually solicited they made an advisory board, set down an advisory board to advise them on how to be a first mover in Europe in circular economy. And I'm sure that there were very smart people in that advisory board, but there were no one that knew anything about raw materials. And so they published a report with some good points in it, but also with a completely closed circle, with bricks turning to cell phones, turning to something else, and just, this eternal loop of things going around. And so I think that for us to actually pragmatically address these goals, there needs to be also the reality check that we can provide. That yes, you want this, you need tungsten.
And
yes, you want this.
If you didn't need to feed resources in there, then they wouldn't be hitting some of those SDGs in terms of, for example, providing sustainable employment and those sorts of things.
No, and no growth.
I'm going to go to Henry, and then I'm going to take a comment from Francis and Richard, and then we'll...
No, I was going to try and link those two things, which is, why is it that people's materials awareness is so low in the West? And I think part of it is that globalization shifted a lot of those supply chains to China, so we were divorced from the link with manufactured products. And I am frankly amazed that the smartphone and phone industry has got away with what it has, and it took Amnesty last year to go to the Congo and say these guys are using child labor. No one cared for years and years. Now EVs come along, people really care, because they're like, well, they're supposed to be green. How can we employ children? Yeah. That's a shift. The other thing, though, I think, is we did shift everything to China, and now China's saying we don't want a polluting environment. We don't want to assume your CO2 emissions, make you look good. But so they want to now shift stuff. And this whole Belt and Road, which is probably the most ambitious program of the 21st century, they want to shift excess capacity to other countries. So we've got to make sure pollution isn't then shifted to Pakistan or somewhere, so that we also got to make sure that people are aware of the link. I think that's critical.
I think that there is that ethical dimension which has just got to be spelt out. All right? It's all very good for the good citizens of Surrey to say, not in my backyard, and to object, for example, to fracking. But the consequence, if you think it through, is they are exporting to countries which are least able to manage environmental matters. That, a lot of, quotes, bad things. Now, we have to own that in some way.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the audience, take a few comments and questions from the audience. I would ask you to keep them brief, because I have an eye on the ever-ticking clock. So Francis, then Richard, then Peter, and then to you.
Just wanted to pick up a couple of points. First of all, on the industrial strategy, there are a couple of proposals I know being considered at the moment, around one into the Faraday Challenge and another for a network going to the engineering and physical sciences group there that certainly do contain a big raw materials component. So this will be a very interesting test of whether that gets treated favourably or we're told that it's nonsense. So let's watch this space. And then I think if we're going to policymakers, linking things to sustainable development goals and circular economy, the really trendy things that everybody's thinking about, is a really good idea. But of course, there's been a lot of work on mining and sustainable development goals, and it interfaces with so many that actually people get lost in that. And I think we would need to rework that for the UK. And if you think if you're a politician in the UK, how can that really apply to you? And if we could do that, maybe then we could make some real impact, and it would be the same with the circular economy. But I think there's a lot of work there usefully we can do, joining up with circular economy specialists who regularly say to me, well, you'll be extinct soon, won't you? And get some of our messages from this meeting across to my academic colleagues, never mind anybody else, would be really useful, and something that the JOLSOC could certainly help to achieve, I think.
So to Richard, and while you're getting the microphone to him, there's a potential hook for what you talk about, Francis, in terms of looking at the SDGs in a UK context. The Environmental Audit Committee, I think, did an inquiry of the House of Commons, did an inquiry into the SDGs and the UK. So that is a helpful tool to put it in a UK perspective. If we could map what we're talking about to that would be a good starting point. Richard.
Yep, thank you. I mean, I think there's a bit of a problem with the circular economy at the moment, when there's a disconnect between the miners and the people who are making the products. I mean, I've just gone to the Apple website that's got a phrase on there. It says, "Can we one day stop mining the earth altogether?" And they say, "It sounds crazy, but we're working on it." Yeah. So I'm just trying to work out how are Apple working on stopping mining? You know,
that statement.
So there's a disconnect. We had Elon Musk who said, "I'm going to source all my cobalt from the US," and then he realised there aren't any US producers of cobalt, and the one that's potential is upstream of a town called Salmon, and you know, is that mine ever going to get permitted? I mean, but I think this is one of the problems, is that the product producers and the mining, we know the supply chain, but there isn't a link between that. And you know, if Anglo American made mobile phones, it would be easier because you could say, yeah, we've made this out of this stuff, and we have to mine it. But that's not what it goes like. Because I mean, it's not. Unfortunately, it's not like wine, because people could favour a wine from Australia because it's got a better flavour. But copper's copper and aluminium's aluminium, and so it's that kind of. To me, there's somehow that life cycle chain is there. We understand it as scientists, but the public don't, and it's getting that across. And the companies don't, you know. Apple clearly think they're going to change the world's mining, but it's not. You know, we're missing something here, I think.
I just want to say about Apple, though, it does seem like they are trying to engage, and I've been to a few conferences recently, and you'll see one person from Apple there, and they do kind of stick out, and they're not sort of part of the crowd, but they're there. You know, they are.
Well, they got into trouble, didn't they, with their tin supply coming from illegal mining in Malaysia. So, and they didn't know, and they had no governance.
I think actually that I think it's going to be the OEMs. I mean, it's going to be the manufacturers that can really change how we think about raw materials. Because it's true that to some extent the mining companies can push and say this is sustainable or whatever. But if the buyer of the raw material doesn't care whether it's sustainable or not, then nothing is going to change. And there's been this tendency of it's just something we buy off the shelf. It comes in containers. It doesn't matter. We take the cheapest. But actually, maybe I'm an optimist, but I really do believe that is changing. And I think that Apple will also learn in the next decade or so about this, because you see a lot of companies that are stepping up and saying we want responsible sourcing. And not just that, actually also responsibility for creating something that be recycled. Because this is another problem with, for instance, phones. I mean, some phones are glued together, so they cannot be repaired because they want you to buy a new one. That is going to get old-fashioned very quickly, I think. I hope.
Sorry, can I just say one thing on that? This goes on to certification. Did you guys talk about this yesterday?
We did touch on it, and Francis talked about
so there's
responsible sourcing this morning.
What we're looking at in Anglo American, especially part of our ethical value chain, is basically certification. Yeah. So, you know, can you actually certify a mine so that any product from that mine can then be considered, you know, certified and then will that give you a commercial advantage for the end consumer who needs to buy these kind of products? So it's a bit like the Kimberley process, whatever flaws within the diamond sector as well.
Fair trade.
Okay, Edmund, one sentence, and then I'm going to, in the interest of microphone management, go over there and then to you, Peter.
I think that there is a need to correct Apple. There is absolutely no doubt about the need for primary production, at least this century, if not well into the next. Because the circular economy, even if it were running as efficiently as we can make it, there will still be a loss.
There's leakage.
There's leakage. It's inevitable.
That was the 2 sentences, Edmund.
Yes.
Sir.
It seems to me that one of the words that has been missing a bit is money. And we had a contributor yesterday who was very hard-nosed about the position the mining companies find themselves in. They have to make a profit. They have to produce their product and be able to sell it at a cost that the market will buy. And that is clearly a rather fundamental discipline. And I think the examples that have been given, Apple, it's worth Apple's while to send people to conferences to make themselves appear green, because reputation management is crucial. And that is absolutely critical for their marketing. The same is true for Anglo American and its CSR. It's good for business. And it makes money because it makes getting licenses easier. It makes it more acceptable at opening a new mine or continuing to mine or whatever. I'm not being cynical about it. I'm not being critical of it. But I think that is an aspect of reality that we all need to think about. I think the other massive challenge in all of this is the absolutely endemic short-termism at every level, from the politics downwards. And most of the things we've talked about are actually to do with long-term issues. And I thought the architect, who's unfortunately, I think, left us, made some very good points. But buildings that the Romans built, or the Greeks, were meant to last forever. And indeed, much of the Victorian infrastructure was meant to last at least for a very long time, and it's doing pretty well. But modern office buildings in cities like London have a design life of 20 or 30 years. They're not meant to last longer than that. Most of the offices I've worked in my working life were new buildings, and none of them's there anymore. They've all gone. And I'm not that old. I'm certainly not as old as reinforced concrete. So that is another massive challenge, I think, in all of this. The short-term focus in so much of the world around us, and it conflicts with many of the things that have been said.
So, a comment from Peter, and then I'm going to come back to the panel with the... Sorry, Sarah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I wanted to add something to the debate today, because there's one lot of friends that we have in the mining industry that haven't had a mention, and that is the London Stock Exchange. For example, Anglo American, a year and a half ago, was selling at this great sum of £2 a share. A few days ago, it was up to £14, nearly £15 a share. Now, that is an increase of 7 times over in a year and a half. And this is shows the extent to which the financial community in London are fully aware of the importance of mining and the contribution that it's making. And I just wanted to draw this to your attention, so perhaps some of you will be able to benefit from this incredible achievement. It's not just Anglo, it's all the 6 mining companies based in the UK who've also had similar performances.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to take that as a cue to lead me neatly into a few closing comments, because we've got about 6 minutes left. And some of us have planes to catch, I know. So thinking about outputs and communities that we're reaching out to, and Peter has reminded us of one, the financial community. But rather than getting into more discussion about audiences and so on, some suggestions that have been made about outputs from this meeting and potential next steps. David raised the question of some sort of briefing note, Geological Society-led statement of some sort around the SDGs and geology, and that's certainly something we have in hand. It's been suggested that we develop some sort of informal note, communique, to the people leading the Resourcing Future Generations conference in June next year. So I'm just putting these thoughts out there, and then I'll come back to you. As a stepping stone to that, and that won't be a sort of great polished work, and probably not a public work, it'll be a sort of a note, but it could be a note from us, the foregathered community of some sort, if it was circulated and commented on, or at least seen as an output from this conference into that conference. As a stepping stone towards that, a suggestion is that I've certainly been scribbling some notes, and I know that other people have been doing the same, that we try quite quickly to get out some pretty headline notes of what we've talked about in the last couple of days. If you're happy for us to share that with you, we've got all your email addresses, and if people wanted to add into that so that there's a sort of shared record of here are some of the things we talked about, as a source document for us to draw on things we do next, that might be useful. And I hope that the presentations, or most of the presentations, slides at least, will be able to go online, and if we haven't contacted speakers already to say, can we do that, then we'll be doing that, and if people need to sanitize them and take out bits, then fine, of course. So those are some potential outputs, ideas about just rather mechanical things we can do coming out of this meeting. Any closing thoughts from you, the panel, on those, on other things we should be doing as next steps, either particularly out of this meeting or in a more general sense, based on the thoughts with the conversations we've had? What are the next steps we should be taking?
I think we do need to gather together in a very short note, try to distill what we've talked about. And the opportunity to influence that programme in Vancouver still remains. I'm one of a number of international advisors to that meeting, all right? And I think there's sort of potential to take this sort of discussion forward another step or two. So I would strongly urge you that if we manage to get together something which is short, if you've got some thoughts, because it will buzz, because, you know, what I remember will not be the same as what you remember. It will, in some sense, represent your views. But I think that we do need to think about how we communicate with other audiences. If you go out onto Piccadilly, how many of the people who are walking up and down looking into the shop window of Fortnum & Mason would have any idea about what we've been talking about? And that needs a lot of skill to try to present to them the issues as we see it. And I think that we need to do that and tailor output to various audiences.
Karen.
And we need your help.
Yeah, I can be very brief, because I think that is the most important thing, is to take the message outside of this room. And I think that there are a lot of, there's so much focus on raw materials now, there's so many events, there's so much happening, but it's very often the same people in the room and preaching to the choir, and everyone is nodding, and this is like great. But I think we really have to make sure that we get out in other audiences, both like this, but also writing and however we can.
Henry.
Yeah, and I think communication's critical. I do think you can hitch a lot of these messages to EVs, changes that are going on. I think people want to read about that.
Yeah.
I also think mining point of view, a lot of conferences are just miners, but I think it would be great to get, you know, like we've seen today, other people at those mining conferences and get different points of view. That would be my thoughts.
Froydis.
I think, well, we're going to keep on trucking to try to get our good stories out, and also be very transparent about our challenges, because there is definitely, I think, an ego shift, especially within Anglo American, that we can't do a lot of things that we need to do alone, and that we need to do it in partnership. And so we will be reaching out a lot more broadly. So hopefully that will widen the group of people that will not necessarily be vested in mining, but understand the importance of and how mining can contribute to some of these really big societal challenges that affect everybody.
Well, I think I will take that and your other comments as tacit permission to kind of treat this as a little bit of a group where we can exchange one or two ideas in the coming weeks and months. We're in the fortunate position, GDPR, data protection, has not yet kicked in, so as long as we do all our communications before next May, we'll be fine. But we'll keep you informed about plans we take forward on this front. And I think in particular we can certainly commit to getting some notes together and putting some sort of communique into the RFG project. But there's lots of other ideas there that we'll make sure at least don't get lost in terms of them being documented, whether or not we can do all of them right now, or certainly whether the Geological Society can take a part in that. I'd like to thank everyone who's spoken during the conference, and including our panellists just now. So please join me in thanking our panellists, and thank you as well to you. And bon voyage.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you. I'll see you next week.